False Start. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2017 by Christine Kersey. Chapter 1. Brock Remington parked in the driveway of his childhood home, a kaleidoscope of emotions crashing over him. He hadn't been expecting to come to Rosebridge, Idaho, but a phone call the night before, telling him that his father had died of a massive heart attack, had changed his plans. Why had he waited so long to come home for a visit? It was true that he'd been extremely busy playing for the Sacramento Vipers, but was that really an excuse? His father had always been there for him, teaching him how to catch his first football, supporting him as football became his passion, all the way through being there when Brock was drafted into the NFL. It had never occurred to Brock that his father could be taken from him without warning. Now, though, as he shut off the engine of his rental car and stared at the house where he'd spent so many happy years, he frowned deeply as regret washed over him. After losing his mother to cancer when he was a child, Brock should have known that life could, and would, take unexpected turns, that he should never take his loved ones for granted. His gaze slid to the neighboring house where his old high school buddy, Wes Hunter, had lived. Brock had lost touch with Wes and had no idea what he was up to, but he remembered spending many happy hours at the Hunters' home. Then an image of Wes's little sister, Ainsley, popped into his mind. She was 4 years younger than Brock and Wes, and whenever the two boys had gotten together, she'd always try to include herself in their fun. Shaking his head at the memory of the gangly girl who'd they teased until she cried with frustration, Brock longed for those simpler days. Then again, he loved his life now. Being one of the best tight ends in the NFL was pretty amazing. He'd worked hard to get where he was, and he loved every minute of it. He just wished his father was still around to enjoy it with him. Exhaling a breath of regret, Brock opened the car door, the heat of the July afternoon pressing down on him. Then he went inside the house. Ainsley Hunter heard the car pull into the Remingtons' driveway and peered out the front window of her house. Curious who it was, she stared hard, but the tinted car windows made it impossible for her to see who was inside. She had seen the ambulance at the house the day before and had learned that Dan Remington had passed away. Saddened by the news, she wondered if Brock would be coming home for the funeral. Except for watching Sacramento Vipers football games, Ainsley hadn't seen Brock in ages. 10 years earlier, when she was just 14, he'd left for college. And though he'd come home for school breaks, she'd been busy with her own life, and with her brother Wes away at college, Brock had never come over to their house. And then when she turned 18, she'd moved out of her parents' house. Now, though, her parents had moved out of state for her dad's job, and they'd let Ainsley rent their house while they were gone. When they'd offered her a killer deal, she'd agreed without a second thought. Her job as a dental hygienist paid reasonably well, and she planned on saving for a down payment on a place of her own. Watching the car in the Remingtons' driveway, when the driver's door swung open and a tall man stepped out, Ainsley gasped. It was Brock, and he looked even better in person than he did on the football field. That was saying a lot, because on the football field he looked mighty fine. 6'4" with a powerful build, Brock was an imposing presence. Add to that his chiseled cheekbones, neatly trimmed beard, full lips, and soulful brown eyes, and Ainsley thought it was a shame to hide those good looks under a helmet. Watching him as he climbed out of the car and walked toward the front door of his childhood home, Ainsley softly chuckled at the memory of trying to insinuate herself into the middle of whatever it was he and Wes had been doing, playing video games, shooting hoops in the driveway, or just hanging out. She shook her head, her long hair softly moving against her shoulders. Those boys had put up with her to a point, but had always quickly tired of her insistence that they should let her join in their games. Appraising Brock's broad shoulders as he stepped onto the porch before disappearing from view, Ainsley decided she should go over and offer her condolences. Both of his parents were gone now, and with him being an only child, who would he turn to for comfort? Ainsley knew he dated lots of women. Yes, sometimes she internet stalked him, but she didn't know if he had a steady girlfriend. Anyway, if he did, wouldn't she have come with him? It was early afternoon on a Sunday. Ainsley would give him a chance to settle in, but then she would go over and see how he was doing. Chapter 2. Even though it was a Sunday, the funeral home had been extremely helpful in getting the funeral arrangements figured out. Helping matters was the fact that several years earlier, Brock's father had arranged many of the details himself. At the time, he told Brock that he'd done this because after going through the challenges of arranging Brock's mother's funeral, he didn't want the burden of his own funeral to fall on Brock. Though there had only been a few details left to finalize, it had still left Brock feeling tired, and now all he wanted to do was stay in the recliner and veg in front of the TV, which is exactly when the doorbell rang. Not feeling like company, he frowned, rolled his neck from side to side, then settled more comfortably into the plush chair. The doorbell rang again. Knowing there were many people in Rosebridge who knew his father and might want to pay their respects, he pushed himself out of the recliner with a sigh, then trudged to the door and pulled it open. On his front porch stood an angel. At least, she looked like an angel to him. Honey blonde hair, long and wavy, cascaded over her shoulders, and ruby-red lips framed straight white teeth. And that smile, it lit up her entire face, making her blue eyes sparkle. He stared at her, familiarity tickling the back of his mind. Did he know this angel? Hold on, was this Ainsley Hunter? Wes's baby sister? She was no longer a baby, that was for sure. Completely taken aback, it took Brock a moment to find his voice, and when he spoke, he couldn't hide his astonishment.
Ainsley?
Her smile only grew. You remember me? Well, of course he remembered her, but not looking like this. Then again, it had been 10 years. 10 years that had done wonderful things to her face, and her body. Trying not to scan her body with his eyes, he worked hard to keep his focus on her face.
Of course I do. How could I forget Wes's little sister?
Had he really just said that? Like that was the only way he saw her? It didn't matter. He was in town to take care of his father's affairs before going back to Sacramento. That was all. He didn't need the complication of rekindling old friendships. Wait, she'd never actually been his friend, just the sister of his friend. A battle raged in his mind over how to see her, but then he forced himself to slow down and focus on why she was there. Brock looked so much better up close, it was all Ainsley could do not to throw her arms around him and give him a big hug. Of friendship, of course. She was dating Tommy Zimmerman. Well, not seriously, but still, it wouldn't be appropriate for her to hug Brock in any romantic way. Not that she was thinking about him like that. Of course she was thinking of him like that. Even when she was a preteen, there had been something about him that had intrigued her, drew her to him. Maybe that was why she could never leave him and Wes alone. This realization took her by surprise. Why had she not figured this out before now? Blinking twice in quick succession, Ainsley focused on what Brock was saying. Did he just call her Wes's little sister? Is that the way he saw her? Couldn't he see that she had grown up? She was 24 now, living on her own, a full-fledged adult, just like him.
What can I do for you? He asked with a smile.
She glanced toward her house and pointed in that general direction. I live in my parents' house now. Well, they don't live there anymore. I live alone. I moved in a few months ago.
Why was she babbling?
But she knew why. That's what she did when she was nervous. Why did Brock make her nervous? Anyway, I heard about your father, and I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about your loss. At her words, a curtain of sorrow slid over Brock's eyes. Is there anything I can do? She added. Anything you need? Maybe I can make you dinner. Are you hungry? And what did such a large man eat? Especially one in the NFL. Surely he had to eat thousands of calories a day to maintain his size. Not that he was fat, because he was nowhere near fat. He looked like he was all muscle. Very attractive muscle. Muscle she wouldn't mind running her fingers over. Blood rushed to her face. Ainsley was just as friendly as Brock remembered from his childhood. Warmth flowed over him at the familiarity of it, the familiarity of her. It was just what he needed, because despite his grief, from the moment she'd arrived, it was as if the weight on his shoulders had lifted.
Sure, he heard himself say, I'd love dinner.
Would you? Because I'm a pretty good cook. Not as good as my mom, maybe. You always liked my mom's food, didn't you?" Now that she mentioned it, before he headed off to college, he had eaten dinner at their house many times, and her mother's food had been delicious. Remembering how he and Wes liked to tease her, he smiled.
"If your food's not as good as your mom's, then I'm not sure."
He let his words trail off. Her eyes went wide, and he also remembered how gullible she'd been. Still was, apparently.
"Just kidding, Ainsley. Whatever you make will be perfect."
"Okay." She paused. "What do you eat? I mean, you probably eat a lot, right?" Then her mouth slammed shut like she hadn't meant to say that out loud.
Suppressing a laugh, he smiled. "Yeah, I do eat a lot."
"I can make lasagna. Will that work?" Just then, he didn't care what she made. He was just looking forward to eating with her.
"Lasagna sounds great. Can I bring anything?"
She shook her head. "No, don't worry about a thing. Just come over in a couple of hours."
"I will."
She smiled. "I'll see you later." Standing in the open doorway, he watched her walk across the grass to her house. His day had just brightened considerably. Chapter 3. Why was she so nervous? Ainsley spread the cottage cheese over the lasagna noodles, then sprinkled mozzarella over that, before pouring half of the meat sauce on top and spreading it evenly inside the casserole dish. After repeating the layers over more noodles, she put the dish in the oven and set the timer for 30 minutes. Then she began setting the table. After inviting Brock for dinner, Ainsley had remembered that she'd made plans with Tommy. How that had completely slipped her mind, she didn't know. She'd had to counsel with Tommy, telling him she was having an old friend over for dinner. Brock had actually been a friend of her brother's, so that was mostly true. Anyway, Tommy had said that was fine, that he had an appointment to show a client some houses, that he hoped this client would finally make up his mind and buy a house already. Carefully folding the napkins before placing them next to the plates just so, Ainsley finished setting the table and stepped back to see how it looked. Then she scolded herself for worrying so much about impressing Brock. His mind had to be on losing his father, not on whether her table would pass an etiquette inspection. Regardless, she wanted everything to be perfect. The doorbell rang. He's early, she thought. Panic swelled within her. Then she told herself to calm down. This was just Brock, Wes's friend from high school, who was also a world-famous NFL football player known to millions of fans. The panic returned with a vengeance. Now a knock sounded, loud and strong. Okay, she thought. Breathe, Ainsley, breathe. Listening to her inner voice, she felt her nerves settle enough for her to glide to the front door before pulling it open, a welcoming smile on her face. "Come in," she said, sweeping her hand toward the living room as she tried not to notice how very attractive Brock looked in his dark jeans and dark gray button-up shirt. She failed miserably. "Thanks," he said, as he stepped inside, towering over her as he passed. Had he been that tall at 18? She couldn't remember. Of course, she'd only been 14 and hadn't yet reached her full height, all 5 feet 5 inches. Walking inside the Hunter's house filled Brock with all kinds of good memories. Memories that took him back to his teenage years. His eyes automatically went to where the TV used to be, searching for the video games he and Wes had played. He almost expected to see them lying in a haphazard pile. Instead, a large ficus tree sat in that corner, its branches full and green. "Is that real?" he asked, walking over to it and rubbing a leaf between his fingers. Ainsley laughed. "No, plants and I don't exactly get along." He liked her honesty. He turned to face her. "Easier to take care of, too." "Yep, just dust it once in a while, and it's good to go." She paused, then pointed to the kitchen. "I need to make the French bread. Do you want to come in there while I work?"
"Yeah. Do you need any help?"
She shook her head, her eyes never leaving his face. "No." Then, with a smile, she turned and walked into the kitchen. Brock followed her, liking the view. She wore form-fitting jeans that hugged her curves in all the right places, a pair of low-heeled boots, and a turquoise blouse that made her lightly tanned skin glow. She moved to the island counter, so he stood on the other side. Watching her expertly slice the French bread lengthwise, he kind of marveled at how different this Ainsley was compared to the 14-year-old girl he remembered.
Looks like you've made French bread before.
Laughing, she spread a butter and garlic mix onto the soft white bread, then looked up and met his eyes. I've lived on my own for quite a while. Her voice rang with the complete confidence of a woman who could, and did, take care of herself. It made Brock look at her with fresh eyes that appreciated this grown-up version all the more.
I can see that, he said, his voice deep with approval.
Ainsley heard something in Brock's voice that caught her attention, something that woke the butterflies in her stomach. Daring a glance at his face, she saw him watching her intently. This was all wrong. She was dating Tommy, and Brock was a famous athlete. He probably had harems of women waiting for him back in Sacramento. She needed to put aside this attraction she had to him, this girlhood crush, and focus on giving him the emotional support he needed at his time of loss. Turning her attention back to the French bread, she carefully sliced the loaf into serving-sized pieces and placed them on a foil-covered cookie sheet, ready to put in the oven once the lasagna came out. Then she turned her attention to the salad.
Are you sure you don't want some help with that? Brock asked.
It would be best if he stayed on the opposite side of the island. She smiled at him and shook her head. No, I'm good. She tore the lettuce into smaller pieces.
So, Ainsley, he said, drawing her attention to him once again, what have you been up to all these years? I don't think I've seen you in, what?
10 years. The words came out of her mouth too fast. Now he would think she'd been keeping track, which she had been. Something like that, she added with a shrug.
He smiled. I think you're right. It has been 10 years.
If you say so.
She tried to sound casual, and she thought she might have pulled it off. So, he said again, what have you been up to?
Softly chuckling, she replied, Nothing as exciting as you.
One side of his mouth tucked up in a smile. I'd still like to know.
Flattered that he asked, she took a tomato out of the fridge and began chopping it. First, I finished high school.
Why had she said that? It made it sound like she was a baby compared to him. He was only 4 years older than her. That wasn't much at all. Not at their age. He laughed. I'm glad to hear that. I remember your parents getting pretty mad at Wes and me when we skipped school once or twice.
She looked up and met his eyes with a smirk. Only once or twice?
Maybe 3 times.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, he said, stretching out the word, I doubt your parents would have let you drop out.
Oh, no. She adamantly shook her head. No way.
What'd you do after graduation? All those years ago.
She chuckled. All those years ago? Isn't your 10-year reunion coming up soon?
I think I just missed it, but point taken.
She tossed all the salad ingredients together and carried the bowl to the table before coming back to the island, safely across from Brock. After I graduated, she grinned, with honors.
Of course you did.
Was he being facetious, or did he really remember that she was smart?
Probably the former. He'd barely paid attention to her back in the day.
I earned a degree in dental hygiene, and now I work as a dental hygienist for Dr. Harris.
He nodded with apparent approval. How do you like that?
I love it, actually.
I guess we're both pretty lucky then.
Tilting her head, she asked, Why do you say that?
We both get to do what we love.
The timer for the lasagna went off. Ainsley took the casserole dish out of the oven and set it on the table, then changed the oven to broil before putting the French bread inside.
That looks and smells really good. I think you might actually cook better than your mother.
Ainsley closed the oven door, then turned to him with a smile. I guess we'll see in a few minutes. Chapter 4. They sat across from each other at the table, Ainsley trying to get over the surreal feeling of having a meal with Brock Remington, just the two of them.
What are you thinking? He asked, after they'd both gone silent.
Ainsley chuckled. That it's nice to chat with you without you and Wes teasing me. Brock threw his head back and laughed. Then he grinned.
But teasing you was so fun.
Her smile matched his. For you, maybe. All she'd wanted was to have Brock and Wes pay attention to her. Maybe Brock more than Wes, but all she'd ever gotten was picked on.
It's funny what we do as kids, he said, before polishing off his first helping of lasagna.
When she noticed he'd finished, she said, Please, eat as much as you'd like. She didn't want him going hungry.
He scooped out 2 large squares of lasagna and put them on his plate, as well as 2 more slices of French bread. "By the way," he said, as he forked a large noodle covered in meat sauce, "I can officially say that you're a better cook than your mother." Beyond thrilled, Ainsley beamed. "Thanks, and I promise I won't tell her you said that." His eyes widened in mock concern. "You better not." He ate a few more bites. "What's Wes up to?" Despite all the years of teasing, Ainsley was close to her brother, and she smiled softly as she pictured him. 2 years ago, he married a sweet girl from South Carolina, which is where he's living. They had a baby girl a couple of months ago. "Wow, that's awesome. Wes is a daddy." "I know, kinda crazy." They chatted as they ate, but when there was a lull in the conversation, Ainsley asked him something that was on her mind. "How are you doing, Brock? Really?" His shoulders slumped slightly, and he sighed. "It's hard losing a parent, but I'm doing okay." "Do you need help with anything?" She paused before softening her voice. "The funeral arrangements?" Brock smiled sadly. "No, I've got that covered. The funeral's in 3 days, on Wednesday. Now I'm just dreading packing up all of my dad's stuff." Ainsley immediately knew how she could ease his burden. "Let me help you." He barked a laugh. "You want to go through 30 years of my dad's stuff?" Not really, but she hated to think of Brock having to do it all on his own. "Sure, it will be like a treasure hunt." He laughed. "You're crazy." He shook his head. "I never understood why you wanted to hang out with Wes and me, especially when we teased you so much. Maybe you like being tortured." Smiling in memory, despite the way she'd hated being teased, Ainsley said, "I guess I thought you guys were cool. I mean, you are 4 years older than me. You were in high school and I was still in middle school. You guys seemed larger than life in so many ways, all grown up." "What?" Brock's tone showed that he had no clue what she was talking about. "You both could drive. You had jobs. You went on dates." She grinned. "I wanted to be just like you guys." As she considered it, she realized to her, Brock was still larger than life, right there on TV playing football, watched by millions of fans. Suddenly intimidated by his fame, and from what she knew, he was paid extremely well too, Ainsley felt small and insignificant. Certain he had legions of gorgeous women throwing themselves at him, she even felt plain and boring. She was a dental hygienist in Rosebridge, Idaho, for heaven's sake, not some rich and famous supermodel. Why was Brock even spending time with her? Then she knew. Because none of those other women were here right now. She was convenient. She was comfortable. Feeling diminished, Ainsley plastered a smile on her face. "You've done pretty well for yourself," Brock said. She was renting her parents' house while she worked 9 to 5. Compared to all that he'd achieved, she'd barely gotten off the starting blocks. Still, she was proud of what she'd accomplished, that she was supporting herself. Not everyone could be a world-famous NFL player. "Thanks," she murmured. Brock was having a great time. He hadn't felt this relaxed and comfortable since, well, he couldn't remember the last time. Ainsley was just what he needed, and her cooking was amazing. The lasagna melted in his mouth. A knock sounded at the front door. Brows rising, he looked at Ainsley. She shrugged before standing and walking to the front door. From where he sat, he could see the door, so he watched to see who it was. A moment later, Brock saw a man standing on the porch, a man who looked to be in his late 20s. "Tommy," Ainsley said, a note of surprise in her voice. "Hey, babe," Tommy said. Babe? Was this her boyfriend? She hadn't mentioned she had a boyfriend. Why was Brock suddenly hit with a pang of jealousy? The man, Tommy, looked past Ainsley and met Brock's staring eyes. Then he smiled with recognition before planting a quick kiss on Ainsley's lips and walking inside. "Come on in," Brock heard Ainsley mutter as Tommy walked past her and straight toward Brock, his hand held out. "Ainsley didn't tell me you were the friend she was having dinner with," he said, a wide smile on his face. "I'm Tommy Zimmerman, Ainsley's boyfriend." So, his guess was accurate. Not liking the man, Brock stood anyway and forced a smile. Then he shook Tommy's hand, gratified to note that he was a good 6 inches taller than this boyfriend. Brock Remington, Brock replied. Then he released Tommy's hand. I already knew that, Tommy said with a chuckle. I'm a big fan. Then he turned to Ainsley. Why didn't you tell me Brock Remington was coming for dinner? Instead of canceling with me, we could have all eaten together. She'd canceled with her boyfriend to have them over? Interesting. Brock looked at Ainsley, whose eyes went from Tommy to Brock and back to Tommy. She began. I didn't think about that. No worries, Tommy said. I'm here now. He looked at their plates, which were nearly empty. Then he smiled at Ainsley. Looks like I made it in time for dessert. What was this guy's problem? Couldn't he see that he'd interrupted something? Realization dawned on Brock. Tommy obviously knew exactly what he was doing. If Ainsley was his girlfriend, Brock wouldn't want her spending the evening with another man either. The thought of that happening made him tense with jealousy. Then he reminded himself that Ainsley wasn't his girlfriend, had never been his girlfriend, would never be his girlfriend. They hardly knew each other anymore. Their only connection was the time they'd spent together as kids. They were adults now, with their own lives. Ainsley had invited him to dinner because she was thoughtful, not because there could be any kind of future for them. Why was he even thinking about that? He would be back in Sacramento in a week, his time in Rosebridge tucked into his memory bank. I sliced strawberries, Ainsley said. I thought we could put them over vanilla ice cream. Ah, Tommy said, as he put a possessive arm around Ainsley's waist. You always make the perfect dessert. He looked at Brock. Ainsley loves to cook for me. He smiled at her, adoration clear in his eyes. I'm the luckiest guy alive. It was almost too much for Brock. He wanted what Tommy had. Not just the perfect girlfriend. He wanted Ainsley. Chapter 5. Well, this is awkward, Ainsley thought. The last thing she had expected was for Tommy to show up in the middle of her dinner with Brock. They'd been dating for 2 months, but it wasn't anything serious. True, she hadn't been dating anyone else, but that was only because no one else had interested her enough. But she and Tommy weren't boyfriend and girlfriend. Why had he said that they were? They'd never discussed taking their relationship to that level. It was like he felt threatened and wanted to stake his claim, a claim which he had no right to. Then her gaze went to Brock, tall, powerful, beyond attractive, not to mention highly successful doing what most men could only dream of, playing in the NFL. Of course Tommy felt threatened. Looking at Tommy with new eyes, Ainsley had to admit that he had good reason to feel threatened. He was a generally nice guy, although she hadn't felt compelled to discuss upgrading their relationship to boyfriend-girlfriend status. And to be honest, lately she'd been losing interest in him, had been thinking of breaking things off with him. And did Tommy really think she was his girlfriend? She would have to clarify that with him. As far as she was concerned, she was free to date whomever she wanted. At the thought, her focus shifted to Brock. Dating him would be amazing. Only problem was, he would only be in town for a few more days. Besides, why did she think he would want to date her? Someone he remembered as an annoyance from his youth. No, there was no reason to think of him in those terms. He was a world-famous NFL football player, adored by millions, and craved by plenty of gorgeous women. It was beyond doubtful that he would have any interest in her at all. Disappointed that the man she'd crushed on since middle school was so out of reach, she smiled at Tommy. At least he was crazy about her, even if her interest in him was waning. At her look, Tommy pulled her into his arms. Brock had to use all of his self-control not to rush over to Ainsley and drag her away from Tommy and into his own arms. What was wrong with him? He'd never felt like that toward any of the beautiful women who threw themselves at him. So why was he feeling like that toward Ainsley, the girl he remembered as a gangly 14-year-old? Because she was no longer 14, that's why. She was a stunning woman who was self-assured and who brought back all of the warm memories from his childhood. Maybe that was it. She represented the good things from his childhood. Clearly, he was trying to cling to those feelings, and he was doing it through his attraction to her. That's all it was. He could handle that. He just needed to take a step back and focus on the here and now. And now it was time for him to go. "As good as strawberries sound," he heard himself say. "I need to get going."
"Already?" The look of disappointment on Ainsley's face was almost enough to change his mind. But no, he needed to leave.
"Thank you for dinner, Ainsley. It was delicious."
With a nod toward Tommy, Brock let himself out of Ainsley's house and walked back to his dad's house. As he stepped inside and saw all of his dad's things, Brock remembered Ainsley's offer to help him pack it up. They'd never set up a time, and he knew she had to work, so he wrote her offer off as a nice gesture that would probably never come to fruition. Disappointed that he wouldn't see much of her before he left, in a way, he was also relieved. Better to put this attraction to her behind him. He only had one reason to be in Rosebridge, to put his father's affairs in order, not to fall for a pretty woman from his youth. Chapter 6. Ainsley was tired. It had been a long day at work, but despite that, she'd promised Brock that she would help him sort through his dad's things, and she was determined to follow through. It didn't hurt that she was also eager to have an excuse to see him. Even though she knew there could be nothing beyond friendship with him, she'd enjoyed chatting with him at dinner the night before. Their conversation had been easy and comfortable. That is, until Tommy had shown up. What had he been thinking, just dropping by like that, as if he was entitled to see her whenever he wanted to? If he hadn't shown up, she was certain Brock would have stayed for dessert, and they would have gotten to know each other better. But why did she want that? Her attraction to him had always been powerful. Getting to know him would only make it that much more painful when he had to leave. Sighing with frustration, Ainsley changed into jeans and a t-shirt, then walked over to the Remington home. Brock's rental car was in the driveway, so she knew he was there. With her finger poised over the bell, Ainsley paused. Was this a good idea? Spending time with a man she'd watched from afar for the last 10 years? The man who'd once been the boy she couldn't get out of her mind. Who was she kidding? She hadn't been able to get him out of her mind ever since he'd gone off to college. Shaking her head, she pressed the bell. She would stay focused on helping him get through this difficult time. That was it. The front door opened, and there he stood, tall, ripped, hot. Nearly catching her breath, Ainsley smiled as her heart fluttered. "Hi there." "Hey," Brock said. As the day had worn on, Brock had decided he was right, that Ainsley wouldn't be coming over. Though disappointed, he knew it was probably better that way. No reason to let himself get caught up in his attraction to her when he was only in town for a few days. But now she was here, standing on his porch and looking more beautiful than she had the night before. And that smile. Something about it took away the melancholy he'd been feeling all day. Vanished, just like that. Maybe she really was an angel. Blinking once to clear his mind of such fanciful thoughts, he focused on Ainsley, deciding that he should memorize that lovely face, that sunny smile, those blue, blue eyes. Maybe he could get a picture of her so that when he was back in Sacramento, he could look at it whenever he needed to brighten his day. Wow, this was new. Feeling so anxious about getting a picture of a woman? Usually people wanted pictures of him. "I'm ready to get started." "Oh, right." For a moment, he'd forgotten why she'd come over. Opening the door to allow her to enter, he stepped back. As she passed him, a light floral scent followed in her wake, intoxicating him. Then he remembered that she had a boyfriend. That tightening of his gut hit him again, that pang of jealousy that he hated with the passion of 1,000 suns. He didn't get jealous. Others were jealous of him. This was not good. How serious were they anyway? Tommy was obviously crazy for her, but how did she feel about him? They weren't engaged, so as far as Brock was concerned, she was fair game. Wait, what was he saying? He was leaving town in a matter of days. There was no reason to think about Ainsley as anything other than a friend. Besides, he wasn't looking for a relationship. They would work on this project together, and then they would say their goodbyes. It would be a piece of cake. "Have you already started?" Ainsley asked as they stood in the living room, acutely aware of everything about Brock. The way his t-shirt clung to his muscular body, the scent of his cologne, the way he looked at her, especially the way he looked at her. What was going on behind those brown eyes? Yeah, I've boxed up half the kitchen. I'm going to donate the stuff to Goodwill. That's a great idea. Then an alarming thought occurred to her. What are you going to do with the house? What if he sold it? With his parents gone and the house sold, he would never come back to Rosebridge. She would never see him again. To her stunned surprise, she felt an actual physical ache in her heart. I'm going to sell it. His voice was calm, like he just said he was going to the grocery store. You can't, she blurted. His forehead furrowed. Why not? Oops. Now what was she supposed to say? Because I can't bear the thought of never seeing you again? No, she would never admit to that. Because, she said, flailing around for a good reason, there are too many memories here. You don't want to let those go, do you? Softly smiling, he touched his forehead with one finger. My memories are up here. I don't need the house to keep those alive. His hand fell to his side. What could she say to that? Not a thing. With resignation, she walked into the kitchen. Picking up a box and setting it on the counter, she turned to him as he entered the room. Which cupboard is next? I've emptied all the lower cabinets, so we can start on the uppers. He opened a cabinet, and Ainsley saw plates stacked inside. If we pack those, what will you use to eat? Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Ainsley had a solution. You'll come to my house for dinner. Really? She wanted to torture herself nightly? What was wrong with her? Brock watched Ainsley's forehead crease with some unnamed emotion. Was she already regretting her invitation? Inviting him to eat with her every night was generous. No surprise there, but she couldn't mean it. What about her boyfriend? Even thinking that word pained him. Would Tommy be joining them too? He pictured Ainsley snuggling with Tommy right in front of him every night he was in town. It would be more than he could take. Thanks, Ainsley, but that won't be necessary. I'm a big boy. I can take care of myself. What? You're going to eat out every night? That's not healthy. Not to mention expensive. His eyebrows rose. Money was the last worry he had. He earned millions every year. Never mind, she said, a blush rising on her cheeks. But it's not healthy. All that fattening food. A cocky smile lifted his lips. I know how to choose the right foods. I'm all grown up now. Then again, the more he thought about it, the more he hated the idea of eating alone every night. Sure, he ate alone plenty at home, but when the other option was being with Ainsley, eating alone sounded like a terrible idea. I'm going to have to insist, she said, her expression fierce. He burst out laughing. You sound just like your mother. She chuckled. I do, don't I? Yes, you do. Good. So, you're coming to my house for dinner, right? How could he refuse now? But he could still set some rules, couldn't he? On one condition. She tilted her head in question. What? Should he say it? What if she took it the wrong way? What if she thought it meant he was interested in her? Who was he fooling? He was interested in her. No, Tommy. A snort escaped her mouth. That's fine. Her response surprised him. He'd half expected that she would be offended. Nodding, he relaxed. Maybe it would take longer to get things in order than he'd originally planned. Maybe he would have to extend his stay in Rosebridge. It had been easy for Ainsley to agree to Brock's condition. Tommy wasn't her boyfriend after all. But the implications of his demand intrigued her. Did it mean he was interested in her? Pleasure radiated inside her. Then a new thought killed her joy. Maybe it had nothing to do with her. Maybe Brock just didn't like Tommy. After all, Brock had left only minutes after Tommy had arrived the night before. Maybe he couldn't relax with one of his fans hanging around. Maybe he was only looking for a place where he could be himself and not have to talk about work or pretend to be excited to talk to a fan. That was all right too, because it meant she would get him all to herself. Chapter 7. "We've gotten a lot done," Brock said as he surveyed the now empty kitchen cabinets. He turned to Ainsley with a smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." She grinned. "I know. I'm awesome like that." He couldn't disagree. She was awesome, and as he appraised her, he had a sudden desire to kiss her. Down boy, he thought. She was a friend, there to help him, nothing more. He had to cool his attraction to her. "I have to admit, I don't know if I have the energy to make dinner tonight." He laughed. "So much for your promise to make dinner for me every night." Softly chuckling, she said, "How about if I take us out to eat instead?" He wasn't up to facing the fans he was sure would approach him. He loved his fans, he really did, but he was exhausted. "I have a better idea. Let's order a pizza." And as a bonus, Tommy was guaranteed to stay away since they were at Brock's house. "Sounds good to me." Brock called the pizza place that was a favorite back in the day, glad they were still in business. And as they waited for it to be delivered, they started filling boxes with the towels and sheets stored in the linen closet. "Are you going to keep any of your dad's things?" Ainsley asked as they closed up a full box and began filling an empty one. "Just a few special items that remind me of him." "So you're not the hoarding type?" He laughed. "No. In fact, sometimes I get rid of stuff when I should keep it, but I hate clutter." "I'm the same way." When the pizza came, Brock set the box on the coffee table, then sat on the couch. Ainsley sank onto the cushion beside him. "All this packing reminds me of helping my parents move," she said, as she took a slice of pizza and set it on a paper plate. "They had years' worth of stuff in their house, too." He folded a slice of pizza in half, then took an enormous bite. After finishing it off, he said, "Packing and moving is definitely not my favorite thing to do, but this wasn't something I wanted to hire out. These are my dad's things." He looked around the room where he'd spent his childhood, a very happy childhood, and a knot formed in his throat. "I didn't want just anyone going through it." He pictured his dad, smiling at him, proud of all he'd accomplished. He would never see that face again, never see the pride shining from his eyes. He had no one. He was an orphan. Grief cascaded over him, and his throat clogged with tears. Ainsley placed her hand on his knee and smiled softly at him. Seeing the empathy in her face, it was like a dam broke. "I miss him already." Brock's voice hitched on the tears he was desperately trying to swallow, but they refused to stay down. And as he looked at Ainsley, saw the sweet caring on her face, something inside him slid open, and he knew he could show his grief, that she wouldn't think less of him for crying. He drew in a ragged breath, and as he exhaled, he couldn't hold back the sobs any longer. Shoulders shaking, heart breaking, Brock let it all come out, and when Ainsley's arms went around him, he let his head fall to her shoulder, let himself be comforted by her warm body, her sweet embrace. Ainsley was grateful that she could be there for Brock, and as he continued to sob, she stroked his back, murmured words of comfort, used a soothing voice, anything to give him solace. Finally, his tears slowed, then stopped. He lifted his head from her shoulder, and with a sad smile, he stood and left the room. She could hear the water running in the bathroom, and when he came out, his eyes were red, but he looked like he felt better. "I'm sorry about that," he said, as he sat beside her on the couch. "No, it's fine. Sometimes you need a good cry. It happens to the best of us, even NFL football players." Smiling, she added, "You're human too, Brock, even if what you do on the field seems like something only a superhuman would do." He laughed. "Are you saying you watch my games?" Had she said too much? Admitted too much? "I may have seen a game or two." That was a lie. She'd watched every game that was broadcast. His eyes twinkled. "The truth comes out." Glad he was feeling better, she asked, "What truth?" Brock would have preferred to not melt down in front of Ainsley, but it hadn't seemed to bother her, not in the least. Of course, she'd known him when he was a kid. That made a difference somehow, like she knew him better than anyone else did, like she accepted him for him. The fact that he was an NFL star was just a bonus.
He had the feeling she would be there for him if he was just a Joe Schmo regular guy. This knowledge did something interesting to his heart, made him want to kiss her. He was going to kiss her. Ainsley wondered what Brock had meant and asked again, "What truth?" Brock's lips slowly curved into a smile that made butterflies take wing in her belly. "The truth that you're secretly a fan." Grinning, she said, "A fan? A fan of what?" He ran a finger along her jaw, leaving a trail of fire. Then his finger stopped under her chin, keeping her gaze fixed on his. "A fan of mine." His voice was soft, yet deep. He was right. She was a fan of his, but it had nothing to do with football. She'd crushed on him since she was in middle school, before the world had ever heard of Brock Remington. And now, the way he was looking at her, the way he touched her skin, she knew he wanted to kiss her, and heaven help her, she wanted the same thing, desperately. Then an image of him surrounded by beautiful women filled her mind. Once he left Rosebridge, once he was back in his world, he would quickly forget her. Better to protect her heart by not letting him kiss her, because Ainsley was absolutely certain that a kiss from him would bind her to him more deeply than she would be able to withstand. She couldn't let things get that far. With her lips lifting in a soft smile, the man's eyes were still red from his breakdown after all. Ainsley gently removed Brock's finger from her chin, then stood. "I think I'd better get going." Disappointment clouded his eyes, but she had to think of herself. Whereas a kiss from him could send her into a downward spiral of heartbreak, what would that same kiss mean to him? He was in the depths of grief. Kissing her was probably something he had decided to do on a whim, something that would make him feel better in the moment, but after everything, it would be meaningless to him. He would get over her rejection. Brock couldn't believe Ainsley had shoved his finger away and leapt to her feet. Okay, maybe she hadn't shoved and leapt, but she might as well have. Clearly, she was rejecting him. Another first for him. How many more of these firsts would he have to endure? How many more was he willing to discover? Perhaps she was in love with Tommy. If so, Brock needed to back off. It wasn't right for him to pursue her when she was with someone else, no matter how much he might want to. Besides, what would be the point when he was only in town for a few days? The truth was, he wasn't ready to give up yet, even if he wasn't sure of his motives. Ainsley was stunning. She made him feel good. She represented home. But was that enough of a reason? Watching her as she stood in front of him, he didn't care about reasons. All he knew was that he had to make her his. He stood as well. "I appreciate your help, Ainsley." "Any time." Did she mean that? With a chuckle, he glanced around the space before meeting her eyes. "There's lots more to do if you have time to help." He could see the hesitation in her eyes. Then she said, "I'm off at 3 tomorrow. I can come over then if that works." Thrilled that they would have more time to spend together, he nodded. "That would be great." "Okay, I'll see you then." With that, she left, and Brock immediately went online to arrange a surprise for her. Chapter 8. "Who are they from?" Ainsley's co-worker Tessa asked as Ainsley admired the beautiful bouquet of colorful flowers that had just arrived for her. She and Tessa were in the reception area at the dentist's office, and Ainsley could feel everyone in the room, Tessa, the receptionist, even the woman waiting to be seen by Dr. Harris, watching her, listening for her answer. Tommy rarely sent her flowers, but with the way he'd acted so possessive the other night, they were probably from him. Unless Brock sent them. The thought sent a zing of excitement through her. Would he do that? Not able to stand the suspense, she slid the envelope out of the arrangement before removing the card. It said, "Thank you for all you do, Ainsley. You have no idea how much it means to me. B." Grinning with pleasure, she almost forgot everyone was watching her. "It's from a friend," she told Tessa. Tessa's eyebrows furrowed. "So they're not from Tommy?" Tessa was the one who had introduced Ainsley to Tommy, had known Tommy longer than she'd known Ainsley.
Guilt swept over her. Should she feel so happy that another man had sent her flowers? Brock hadn't confessed his undying devotion to her in the note. It was a simple thank you. That fact dimmed her happiness somewhat, until she remembered that he'd been about to kiss her the night before, until she jumped to her feet and left. Besides, she wasn't Tommy's girlfriend, despite the way he'd acted the other night. "No," Ainsley said, "they're not from Tommy." "Huh," Tessa replied. Ignoring the accusatory look on Tessa's face, Ainsley left the flowers on the counter and went back to work. As she cleaned teeth and took x-rays, Ainsley's mind kept going to Brock and the fact that she would see him after she got off work. What if he tried to kiss her again? Would she let him this time? The thought of his gorgeous lips pressed against hers sent a flutter to her tummy. Yes, if he tried again, she would let him. But first, she needed to talk to Tommy, to break things off with him. Seeing Brock again, having her crush rekindled, had emphasized that Tommy was not the man for her. Even though she didn't think there could be a future for her with Brock, there was no reason for her to keep seeing Tommy when she'd already lost interest. It wasn't fair to either one of them. She sent him a text and asked him to meet her for lunch, and he quickly agreed. Then she spent the rest of the morning worrying about breaking the news to him. 2 hours later, she sat in a booth at a local deli, waiting for Tommy to arrive. "Hello, my love," he said as he bent down to give her a kiss moments later. Hearing his words sent her into spasms of guilt and longing. Guilt because she knew she was about to break his heart, and longing because she wanted to hear Brock call her his love, wanted to feel Brock's lips against hers, but not just a spur-of-the-moment kiss, a real kiss, a kiss that meant he was hers. She wished it was Brock who was a permanent part of her life, because she knew even when he left, she would be thinking about him, missing him, wanting him. "Hey," she said to Tommy, not quite ready to tell him the reason for asking him to lunch. They went to the counter and ordered their sandwiches, then watched as a worker made them. "I said light on the mayo," Tommy said, his voice ringing with irritation. Then he spoke under his breath. "Idiot." Cringing, Ainsley was glad she had decided to end things. What he had just done, something she'd witnessed before, only reinforced that he wasn't the man for her. A few minutes later, they sat across from each other in a booth. "How's your day going?" Tommy asked as he took a bite of his salami on rye. She thought about the flowers Brock had sent her and how she'd come to realize that it was time to let Tommy know she was ready to move on. It's been okay." Tommy tilted his head. "Just okay?" All right, it was time, but she hesitated. It was never easy to tell someone that you were no longer interested, even if he was a jerk sometimes. "What's wrong, babe?" Tommy asked as he set his sandwich down. Softly sighing, she shook her head. "I didn't just invite you to lunch for the fun of it, Tommy. I had a reason." Tommy's expression stilled. "What reason is that?" She drew in a breath as she gathered the courage to break the news. I'm sorry, Tommy. I think it's time we moved on." There, she'd said it. Bracing herself for his reaction, she watched him. His eyebrows lowered. "What do you mean, move on?" "I mean, I don't see a future for me with you." Hurt glowed in his eyes. "I see." He huffed out a sigh. "Is it because of Brock? Are you with him now?" She wished that was the reason. "No, we're just friends." Tommy's head tilted. "Really? Because the timing of this seems rather—" His lips pursed. "Coincidental." Was he going to make this more difficult than it already was? "To be honest, Tommy, I've been thinking about this for a while now." "A while?" "Yes." "How long is a while?" Why couldn't he accept this and move on? "A couple of weeks," she said. His eyes narrowed. "But you're just telling me this now." "Uh-huh." Lesson learned. When she knew it was time to end things, she shouldn't put it off. She hadn't touched her sandwich, but she wasn't about to sit through lunch with him now. Folding the paper around it, she said, I'm gonna go."
His nostrils flared. Yeah. Then he jammed the paper around his sandwich before abruptly standing. He stared at her, his face set in a scowl. See you around. Then he turned and stormed out of the deli. Ainsley watched him leave, her heart heavy, but she comforted herself with the knowledge that breaking things off with Tommy had been the right thing to do. Chapter 9. To Brock's dismay, he hadn't gotten as much done as he'd hoped he would. Every time he started filling a box, his mind went to Ainsley and how much more fun it would be if she were there with him, helping him. Checking the time on his phone once again, he grinned. She should just be getting off work. She would be there soon. Had she gotten the flowers? What had she thought? Had she been surprised? Did she like them? Anxious to impress her, he hoped he'd gotten the type of flowers she liked. When he'd ordered the flowers after she'd left the night before, he'd realized he didn't know her likes and dislikes. He would have to work on changing that. Ready for a break, Brock took the grilled chicken salad that he'd bought earlier out of the fridge and began eating it, his mind on the questions he would ask Ainsley in order to get to know her better. Then he asked himself why it was so important to learn more about her. She was an old childhood friend. Well, the sister of an old childhood friend. They weren't dating. In fact, she had a boyfriend she seemed to really like. Frowning in frustration, he finished eating, then chugged down a protein drink, and after he'd cleaned up, he put together more boxes in preparation for Ainsley's arrival. 20 minutes later, she was there. Brock invited her in, happier to see her than he thought he would be. He'd missed her. "Thank you for the flowers," she said with a big smile as they faced each other in the living room. "I wasn't sure what your favorite flower was." "Roses, carnations, daffodils. I love all flowers." That made it easy. "Can I get you something to drink?" With a tilt to her head, she asked, "I didn't know you had anything in that kitchen." He laughed. "Just a few things in the fridge, but you'll have to drink out of the bottle." She shook her head. "That's okay. I'm fine." She glanced around the room. "Where shall we start today?" How about with a kiss, he thought. He wanted to step toward her, pull her into his arms, and press his mouth to hers, but he held back. He would have to follow her lead. He had to respect her boundaries that she'd made clear when she'd abruptly left the night before. "I'm ready to work in my dad's bedroom," Brock said. That was the room that was going to be the hardest to go through. All of his dad's things were there, his clothes and his most personal items. Glad that Ainsley would be by his side, Brock picked up an empty box. "Let's get started." When Brock had opened the front door, Ainsley had been thrilled to see him, her earlier sorrow at her conversation with Tommy slipping away. Seeing Brock standing there, she'd almost told him about ending things with Tommy, but doing that would be like waving a neon sign that said, "I'm crazy about you, and now that I'm single, what are you going to do?" She could imagine the deer in the headlights look on Brock's face. He'd only come to town to take care of his father's funeral and to pack his father's belongings, not to sweep Ainsley off of her feet. She was positive that seeing her hadn't been on his radar, at all. Tossing out the bomb that she and Tommy were no longer dating would be pointless, and it could be enough to make Brock back away from even friendship with her. No, it was better to keep her new relationship status to herself. Instead, Ainsley turned her focus to Brock and what he needed, then followed him into his father's bedroom. She couldn't imagine how difficult it would be to go through the belongings of a lost parent. Both of her parents were still alive, and she was grateful for that, which made her all the more glad that she could be there to help him. She'd known and liked Dan Remington. Over the years, she hadn't seen much of him, but over the last 2 months, ever since she'd moved back into her parents' house, she'd seen him from time to time. They hadn't talked much, but he'd always greeted her with a smile. She would miss his face, miss knowing he was there, that she had a good neighbor. Remembering the way Brock had broken down the night before, a fresh wave of empathy crashed over her, and she fought the urge to throw her arms around him. If she dragged him into an embrace, what message would that send? That she wanted more than friendship? Well, she did want more than friendship, but she couldn't imagine that he felt the same. Not with his glamorous life. Why would he be interested in her? Sure, he might want to kiss her, but where would that leave her when he went back to Sacramento, back to the lifestyle he was used to? Heartbroken and alone, that's where. No, she couldn't chance it. She couldn't risk her heart. But what about her earlier thought that if he tried to kiss her, she would let him? That would never happen as long as she was putting out "don't kiss me" vibes. Torn between wanting to protect her heart and desperation to have him kiss her, Ainsley didn't know what to do. I'll follow his lead, she decided. As they filled box after box with his dad's clothes, Brock was grateful that his hyper-awareness of Ainsley kept him distracted from his grief. She was on the other side of the room, loading his dad's shoes into a box, but Brock was aware of her every move, her every breath. Frustrated that she hadn't given him any indication that she wanted anything beyond friendship, he held back a sigh. They'd been working for nearly 2 hours and had made good progress, but he suddenly needed to get out of the house. He turned to her, but her back was to him as she knelt on the floor in front of the open closet. Watching her, he smiled when she tucked a long strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear without pausing for moving shoes from the closet floor into the box. I don't remember you working this hard as a kid, he said with a grin. She twisted around, a smile on her face, a smile that lit up his soul and made him want to gather her into his arms and absorb her sunny nature. How often did you pay attention to me when I was a kid? She asked, besides when I wouldn't leave you and Wes alone. He laughed. True. But he was paying attention to her now. Too much, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. Do you want to go somewhere? Like, maybe the park? He took a breath. I need to get out of here for a while. Pushing to her feet, she said, Sure, I'd love to. It's a little early for dinner, but how about a treat? A smile of remembrance curved his mouth. Is Red Apple Diner still open? Yes, and their shakes are as delicious as ever. Perfect. We'll pick some up and take them to the park. As Brock opened the passenger door of his rental car for Ainsley, he smiled with the thought that this was like their first date, and if he had anything to say about it, it wouldn't be their last. Chapter 10. When they arrived at Red Apple Diner, Ainsley waited for Brock to open her door for her. Tommy had never opened the door for her whenever they'd gone out, but she liked that Brock did it. He was such a gentleman. He helped her out of the car, and she wondered if all the chivalry made this like a date. And if it did, how did she feel about it? If she were completely honest with herself, she liked it. A lot. They walked side by side, their hands brushing up against one another's. Then Brock held the door for her. It was late afternoon, but before the dinner rush, so it wasn't too busy. Ainsley hadn't been here for ages, and as she walked in, memories swept over her. Memories of dates and fun times with friends. Now, being here with Brock, she almost felt like she was back in high school. Except by the time she'd started high school, Brock was in college. Is that Brock Remington? She heard someone say. Proud to be with him, when he greeted the man who'd asked the question, Ainsley smiled. Despite all that he was going through, he made time for his fans. It must be hard to never be able to go anywhere without people approaching you, wanting to talk to you, to shake your hand. Gratifying, too, but probably tiring. Hey, bro, the man said. I'm sorry about your father. Thanks, Brock replied. A few more people greeted him, then she and Brock slid onto bar stools at the counter and ordered their shakes. Strawberry for me, Ainsley said. She noticed Brock looking at her. What? He grinned. Nothing. Just making a mental list of all your favorites. Was that sweet or what? Had Tommy known all of her favorites? She didn't know. Then she scolded herself. She shouldn't compare him to Brock, not now that she'd ended things with him. Tommy would never have measured up to Brock anyway. The thought jumped into her head, taking her by surprise. I'd like the cookies and cream shake, Brock said, drawing Ainsley's attention to him. Both of those to go. Brock is my dream man. Another thought that came out of the blue. Maybe she needed to let her subconscious talk to her more often. She was learning all kinds of things about herself today. Brock led the way to a shady spot under a tree at the park. Ainsley had been quiet ever since the diner, and he wondered what was on her mind. "How's this?" he asked, as he swept his hand toward the grass beneath the tree. "This is perfect." She settled onto the grass, her body moving with a grace that he appreciated. Then again, more and more, he was learning to appreciate everything about her. Patting the ground beside her, she said, "Aren't you going to join me?" Chuckling, he sat beside her. "I hope you don't mind sitting on the ground." "Not at all." She sucked on her straw. "How's your shake? As good as you remember?" He took a large swallow, the creamy mixture filling his mouth with cold, sweet goodness. "Better than I remember." Her eyebrows went up. "Don't they have good shakes in Sacramento?" "Not as good as these." She laughed. "Guess you should come to Rosebridge more often." The reminder that he'd failed to come see his father as often as he should sent a sharp pain to his heart. "What's wrong?" Ainsley asked. He shook his head. "Nothing." Setting her shake on the grass, she placed a hand on his arm. "You're thinking about your father, aren't you?" Her touch soothed him. "Yeah, I wish—" He looked away before facing her again. "I wish I'd come to see him more." Her thumb made small circles against his skin. "There's no point in having regrets, Brock. You should focus on the good memories you have of him." She was right. And she was perfect. His gaze slid to her bow-shaped lips before lifting to look into her blue eyes. "You're good for me, Ainsley." Her eyes widened slightly, and her thumb stopped moving. "What do you mean?" Her voice was soft. He shifted so that instead of them being beside each other, they were facing each other. Was he going to do it? Was he going to kiss her? Ainsley nearly held her breath as she waited to see what he would do next. When he'd said she was good for him, something had passed between them, a deeper connection. Brock reached across her and placed his hand on the grass on the other side of her. Only a few inches separated them as he appraised her. Mesmerized by the way he was looking at her, her lips parted. "Ainsley," he said, his voice soft, intimate. This was everything she'd wanted, everything she'd wished for. Thinking about her 14-year-old self and how much she'd wanted Brock to notice her back then, she couldn't help it. She smiled. "What?" Brock asked, his lips curving upward as well. "Nothing." He shook his head. "Come on, Ainsley. Tell me what you're thinking about." Softly chuckling, she said, "Okay. I was remembering when I was 14 and how much I wanted you to, well, for you to notice me." "You were just a baby back then." "No, I wasn't." One eyebrow arched. "Compared to the girls my age, you were." His words were like a splash of ice water, because it made her think of how she compared to the supermodels and other gorgeous women he normally interacted with. She was nothing like them. When he went back to Sacramento, would he scoff at the memory of her when he was around those other women? Would he secretly laugh at how unsophisticated she was, how small town? She couldn't do this. She couldn't let herself be drawn in by her attraction to him, no matter how powerful it was. It would only lead to heartbreak. She couldn't let that happen. Brock's lips twitched in a barely suppressed smile, but all the joking was over for her. "I can't do this," she said, her heart already aching. Brock straightened, his arm no longer across her. Space opened between them, and she wanted him right back where he'd been, but she'd already blown it, already told him no. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you're with—" A muscle worked in his jaw. "With Tommy." Not willing to admit the real reason for ending the moment, she clung to the lie. "Right," she said. As she imagined telling him the truth, that she felt inadequate compared to the women he normally interacted with, she could hear his answer. He would say, "That's not how it would be, Ainsley. You're just as beautiful as them. I'd never forget you." Even if he meant it, it didn't matter, because he had to go back to Sacramento. That's where his team was. That's where his life was. It was best to let him believe she was still with Tommy. Disappointed that he'd failed to move the ball forward, Brock was also angry at himself for forgetting that she was with another man, that he had no business making a pass at her. He'd been taught better than that. If he wanted Ainsley in his life, and he was more certain than ever that he did. He would have to keep everything platonic. There was no other way. When he went back to Sacramento, he would keep in touch with her, although if she ended up marrying Tommy, he would have to eventually drift away from her. The thought of her with someone else brought on unfamiliar pains, unfamiliar emotions, but it would be wrong to try to get between them. He wouldn't do it. For all he knew, Ainsley's parents loved Tommy and were hoping for a happily ever after with him. He respected them too much to go where he wasn't wanted. Friendship was the best solution, even if it made his insides clench with regret and dismay. "We should get back," he said. "There's still so much to do." Ainsley began. "I have some other things I need to do." Feeling like an idiot for not considering that she had other things to do besides take care of him, he nodded, his smile tight. "I understand." But knowing she would probably be with Tommy while he was boxing up his father's things irked him. He was sure the man was perfectly nice, but the fact that Ainsley was choosing him over Brock made Brock dislike him, intensely. He had to let Ainsley go. Had to. He couldn't let her into his head like this. If he did, it would affect him when he played football. That was something he could not allow. He had enough on his mind. Tomorrow was his father's funeral. That would be tough enough to get through without picturing Ainsley with another man. At least he was certain she would be coming to the funeral. That comforted him. Pushing aside his feelings, he stood, then he reached out his hand in an offer to help her up. She seemed to hesitate, but then she placed her small hand in his. When his fingers closed around her hand, it was as if a bolt of electricity shot up his arm straight to his heart. So surprised by the feeling that he almost released her hand, he held on, helping her to her feet. She stood in front of him, her eyes on him. He couldn't read the emotion behind those baby blues, but heaven help him, he wanted more than friendship from Ainsley Hunter. The shock of energy Ainsley had felt when her hand had been encompassed by Brock's had taken her by surprise. By the look on his face, she knew he felt it too. It was too bad she couldn't let herself go, couldn't let him kiss her. Too bad she was so afraid of giving her heart to him, for fear of him leaving her again. Wait, was that what she thought? That he'd left her when he'd gone off to college? That he'd only returned to Rosebridge on rare occasions, and had never come to see her? She'd been 14 when he'd left. What did she expect? Maybe nothing. But perhaps she'd harbored a secret hope that he would come back one day, come back for her. Well, he was here now. But she already knew that he would be going back to a life that didn't include her. She couldn't give in to what her heart was begging her to do. She had to stay strong, had to control herself until he left. Only a few more days and he would be gone. Gone for good.
Chapter 11. The next morning, when Ainsley arrived at the funeral home for Dan Remington's viewing, her mind was fully on Brock. This would be a tough day for him, and she wanted to do everything within her power to ease his grief. She walked into the room where the casket was on display, her eyes going right to Brock, who stood near the casket accepting condolences from the people who had come to pay their respects. His face was stoic as he greeted people, accepting hugs and well wishes. Getting in line, Ainsley wanted nothing more than to hold him in her arms and take away the grief she was sure he was feeling. Before she knew it, she was standing in front of him. Without a second thought, she reached up to give him a hug, and he wrapped his arms around her. To her dismay, she heard him stifle a sob. "I'm so sorry, Brock," she murmured. "Your father was a good man, and he was taken much too soon." His arms only tightened around her, and even though the circumstances were sad, she couldn't deny how good it felt to be held securely in his arms. Maybe rejecting his kiss had been a mistake. Brock didn't know what he would do without Ainsley. Having her there, on one of the saddest days of his life, meant everything to him, and despite his grief, holding her against him buoyed him up in a way that shocked him. It was like her energy was flowing right into him, filling him up, giving him the vitality he needed to go on. He didn't want that to end, couldn't let it end. Getting his emotions under control, He let go of her and studied her face. He had to have her in his life. Had to, no matter the cost. But he would have to work that out later. "Thank you for coming," he said. She smiled, her sunniness breaking up the clouds that had been hanging over him all morning. "Of course." "Will you sit with me during the service?" Her lips parted in surprise. "Yes." A sense of peace settled over him. "Thank you." She nodded, then walked over to a pair of women and began quietly talking with them. That's when it hit him. Tommy hadn't come with her. Should he have? Brock thought about it as he greeted the next person in line. There would be no reason for Tommy to stay away. Then again, maybe he had to work. Trying not to read too much into it, Brock focused on the man in front of him. As Ainsley listened to the beginning of the service, she was acutely aware of Brock sitting beside her. She'd been touched that he wanted her right next to him. Then again, most of the people who had come to the service were friends and acquaintances of Dan Remington, not necessarily friends of Brock's. It was no wonder Brock had wanted her at his side. On the other hand, she couldn't forget that the row behind them was filled with several burly football players, teammates of Brock's who had come to support him. The fingers of Brock's left hand intertwined with the fingers of her right. Softly inhaling at the unexpected touch, Ainsley forced herself to relax. Then she gently squeezed his hand to let him know she was there for him. He lifted her hand and rested it on his muscled thigh. Then he covered their clasped hands with his other hand. Loving the feel of him so close to her, she had to resist the urge to lay her head against his shoulder. This was not the time or the place for such an action. Instead, she savored the feel of her hand in his as she listened to the service. Ainsley's hand fit in his perfectly, more perfectly than any other woman's ever had. And knowing she was there, that she'd cared about his father, comforted Brock in a powerful way. The dozens of people who were there to support him, to grieve with him, meant so much to him. But if Ainsley had been the only one to come, that would have been enough for him. In the few days they'd spent together, getting reacquainted, he'd come to treasure her sweet personality, the way she was so willing to help him, the fact that she'd known him before he'd become rich and famous, that she'd been part of his childhood, and that she accepted him for him was huge. She didn't care if he broke down in front of her. She was just so genuine. And to top it all off, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met, and he'd met lots of beautiful women. Maybe her smile had something to do with it. The way it lit up a room made him want to bask in the beams of light coming from within her. He wanted that sunshine in his life every day. Stealing a glance at her profile, he knew he was falling for her, and falling hard. But he would have to hold back. She was with Tommy, and he had to respect that, no matter how much it pained him. The service ended, and they stood to file out, ready to drive to the gravesite for their final farewell. "I'd like you to ride in my car," he said to her, "to the gravesite." He hadn't let go of her hand, and he had no intention of letting go. "I'd be honored." She smiled at him, and he battled the urge to kiss her, but he wouldn't do it as long as she wasn't available. Holding her hand was the most he would do, and today of all days, he needed that contact. Ainsley was beyond pleased that Brock had leaned on her so heavily, that he'd invited her to ride with him to the gravesite. Obviously, she meant a lot to him. That knowledge only deepened her attraction to him. And now that Tommy was out of the picture, it was as if her heart had opened up to Brock all the more. Even if he was leaving in a few days, maybe it was worth the risk to kiss him, to let him know how she felt. Maybe things could work between them. Maybe she shouldn't compare herself to the women that surely threw themselves at him all the time. Then again, maybe she was just a comfortable old friend, someone who was convenient to turn to at a time when he needed a friend. Mentally shaking her head as Brock helped her into his car, she told herself to stop overanalyzing and to just go with it. Without risk, there would be no reward. She would have to remember that the next time she was alone with him. After the graveside service, they drove to a reception hall
where Brock had arranged a catered meal for friends and family so that they would have a chance to chat and catch up. Walking inside, Ainsley was pleased when Brock kept her hand in his, and as they approached his teammates, she was excited to meet them. It was funny. Over the years that she'd watched Brock play with the Vipers, she'd also watched these men, so she almost felt like she knew them. "Josh," Brock said as he strode toward the Viper star quarterback, "I'd like you to meet Ainsley Hunter." Then he smiled at Ainsley. "This is Josh." Ainsley shook his hand, kind of starstruck. "Nice to meet you." He was just as handsome in person as he was on TV. Not as handsome as Brock, but still nice to look at. "Where did Shay go?" Brock asked Josh. Then a pretty woman walked up to them, and Josh put his arm around her. "Hey, Shay," Brock said. "Thank you so much for coming." Shay stepped forward and gave Brock a hug. "Of course." Then she moved back to Josh's side. "Ainsley," Brock said, "this is Josh's girlfriend, Shay Campbell." "Hi," Ainsley said. "It's good to meet you." She couldn't miss the adoration Shay and Josh seemed to have for each other. Envious that they'd found each other, when she felt Brock's hand in hers, she reminded herself that she should never give up hope, even if a future with him seemed unlikely. "This is Hank Parson," Brock said. Ainsley shook the running back's hand. Like the other players, he was built, but not quite as tall as either Josh or Brock, probably just reaching 6 feet tall. But he was quick. Ainsley knew that because she'd seen him in action on the field, on TV at least, and she couldn't help but notice his striking green eyes. "Nice to meet you, Ainsley," he said. She smiled. "Same here." "And finally," Brock said with a grin, "this is Jax Cordova, one of the best pass rushers around." He shook Ainsley's hand. He was even bigger than Brock, maybe 6'5". Next to these guys, she felt like a hobbit, but she could see how much it meant to Brock that they'd come to his father's funeral. They all sat at a large round table, and Ainsley enjoyed listening to the men joke and share stories, thrilled to be included in this illustrious group. Chapter 12. Ainsley leaned her head against the back of Brock's couch and let her eyes slide closed. They had just gotten back to his house after leaving the luncheon, and she was exhausted. She could only imagine how he felt. After the luncheon, Brock's teammates had headed to the airport, but Brock hadn't given any indication that he wanted her to leave him, so when they'd reached their neighborhood, she'd come inside his house with him. Opening her eyes, she turned to face him and saw that he'd closed his eyes as well. Then she heard him softly snoring. Less than a foot of space separated them. Watching him, her heart contracted with love. Yes, love. Though she hadn't seen him for years before he'd come back to town earlier that week, she'd always been attracted to him, and after seeing him at his most vulnerable, she'd come to realize just how deep her feelings for him went. She was nowhere near ready to admit to the depths of her feelings for him, but she knew how she felt, and the knowledge made her smile. Until she thought about him leaving, as he was going to do. He told her he was flying back to Sacramento on Sunday night, 4 days away. The thought of him leaving made her desperately sad, but there was nothing she could do about it. Holding back a frown, she comforted herself with a memory of him holding her hand all that day, first at the funeral service, then at the graveside service, and finally at the luncheon. She'd never pulled her hand out of his. She'd been putting off telling him that she'd ended things with Tommy, but now, as she studied him, she wanted him to know. Even if it would scare him away from mere friendship, she had to take the chance. On impulse, she slid her hand into his. His eyes snapped open, and he turned to her with a smile. "I'm sorry," she said with a grin. "I didn't mean to wake you." His lips curved upward. "I don't mind waking when it's your face I see." Now that she'd acknowledged to herself how truly deep her feelings for him ran, she gazed at him, her heart surging with longing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked in a quiet voice, his head still leaning against the back of the couch. "That I love you," she thought. Not ready to admit her newly discovered secret, she said, "That I'm going to miss you when you go back to Sacramento." He didn't speak for a moment as he kept his eyes steady on her. "I'll miss you too." Would he really, she wondered. His life had to be crazy busy with practices and games and parties and other women. Holding back a frown, she said, "We'll have to keep in touch." He straightened, his head coming off the back of the couch as he turned to her. "I'd like that, but—" His lips pinched together. Worried where he was going with his thoughts, Ainsley asked, "What?" "Tommy may not approve." Knowing that would no longer be an issue, Ainsley let a huge smile burst forth. That wasn't the reaction Brock had expected. He wanted nothing more than to keep in touch with her, but if she and Tommy were serious, it might not be such a good idea. So why was she smiling like that? "What's going on?" he asked, hope threading through him. Her smile only grew brighter. "I broke up with him yesterday." What? He thought. This was the best news she could have given him, especially after such an emotionally draining day. Then a new thought occurred to him. Why had she broken up with Tommy? Certain it had something to do with him, Brock wondered what her expectations were, and could he fulfill those expectations? "I hope you didn't do it because of me." He immediately regretted the comment. How egotistical did he sound? Her smile immediately vanished, and he wished he could suck the words back in. She frowned. "I thought you'd be happy." He was happy. He was ecstatic, but that ecstasy was tinged with caution. Did she think he was looking for a long-term relationship? Was he looking for a long-term relationship? He didn't know. He was too tired to think clearly. "I am happy," he said, desperate to put the smile back on her face. "You don't seem happy." "I'm just tired." Her shoulders sagged. "Of course you are. I'm sorry, Brock. Today isn't about me." Could she be more selfless? The way she always seemed to think about him only made him feel worse about the way he always thought of himself. He had to fix this, right now. Shifting so that he faced her fully, he took her hands in his. "You have no idea how happy I am to know that you're single, Ainsley." And now that she was, he didn't have to hold back any longer. "Really?" Ainsley's voice was tinged with a mixture of disbelief and hope. If he was really happy, why had he said he hoped she hadn't done it because of him? Technically, she'd been thinking about breaking things off with Tommy for a couple of weeks, but seeing Brock again had been the impetus she'd needed to move forward. "Yes, really." "And do you know why?" Shaking her head, she said, "No." A smile slowly spread across his face. "Because then I can do this." One of his hands slid behind her neck, and a moment later, his lips were moving toward hers. Pulse racing, Ainsley held very still, her eyes locked on his as the moment she desperately hoped for, yet had been deathly afraid of, came closer to reality. Those soulful brown eyes bored into her, and with a fresh knowledge that she was in love with him, she forced out all of her fears as she lost herself in the feel of his mouth on hers, the taste of him, the feel of his warm body surrounding her, holding her close. The kaleidoscope of emotions nearly overwhelmed her, but with his arms enfolding her, she let his powerful presence anchor her, and she sank against him. The feel of her in his arms, the taste of her lips, they were better than Brock could have imagined, and he had been imagining them. Ever since the moment he'd found her on his doorstep. He admitted it to himself now. He'd wanted her from the moment he'd seen her, and realized she was the same Ainsley Hunter he'd known in his youth, all grown up. Stunning, smart, compassionate, perfect. His lips devoured hers, and when she melted against him, he knew her attraction to him was as strong as his was to her. Savoring everything about her, he let his lips linger on hers for several more moments before finally pulling away, his eyes on hers, his hand still curled around her neck. As they gazed at each other, her face lit with a smile that brightened his day like nothing else could. This was the best end to this emotionally draining day that he could have imagined, and he was sure his father was smiling down on them. "For the record," Ainsley said, still smiling, "I didn't break up with Tommy because of you. It was something I'd been thinking about doing for a while." Then her lips twisted into a frown. "Although I don't think Tommy believes that." What do you mean?
When I told him there was no future for us, he accused me of breaking up with him because of you."
Not sure how he felt about that, Brock stayed silent. Anyway, did it really matter? The important thing was that Ainsley was now free.
"It's been a long day," Ainsley said. "I should probably go."
Brock didn't want her to leave. Not now that they'd finally moved the ball forward in their relationship. "Are you sure?"
"I don't know about you, Brock, but I'm exhausted, and I have to work in the morning."
Brock couldn't argue with that. He was emotionally wrung out, and he could probably sleep for 12 hours straight. Even so, he would prefer to have Ainsley's company.
"Good night, Brock," she said as she stood.
He stood as well, then walked her to the door.
"If you'd like," she added, "I can come over after I get off work tomorrow."
"I would like that, very much." Was it too soon to kiss her again? He didn't think so. Drawing her into his arms, he smiled before lowering his head to place his lips against hers. It felt amazing to hold her in his arms, to know that she was choosing him. Ainsley couldn't get enough of him. She had been hoping he would kiss her goodbye, and she hadn't been disappointed. Knowing she would see him the next day filled her with excitement. When he finally released her, she smiled as she looked at him. Should she tell him how she felt? Then she remembered his question. Had she broken up with Tommy because of him? Thinking of that stopped her from saying anything. Why had he asked that? Was he worried that she was expecting more from him than he was willing to give? He was flying back to Sacramento in a few days. In all reality, this time in Rosebridge was just a nice interlude for both of them. Real life would hit them soon enough. She had to keep her expectations realistic. For now, she would look forward to spending time with him the next afternoon. She didn't want to think beyond that.
"See you tomorrow," she said, before opening the door and walking back to her house.
Chapter 13. When Ainsley arrived at work the next day, Tessa met her with a frown. "What's wrong?" Ainsley asked, although she had an inkling. Tessa had known Tommy longer than she'd known Ainsley, so Ainsley wondered where her allegiances lay.
"I think you know," Tessa said, before walking toward the back room.
Ainsley followed her.
"Tommy told you we broke up, didn't he?"
Tessa paused in gathering supplies and turned to Ainsley.
"He said you broke up with him."
There was no denying that.
"I did, yes." "He also said you're with that football player, Brock Remington." One of her eyebrows arched. "Is he the one who sent you flowers the other day?"
Annoyed that she felt a need to explain, Ainsley pursed her lips before speaking.
"First of all, Tessa, I'm not with Brock," although she wished she was. "And yes, Brock sent me the flowers, but it was just as a thank you. I've been helping him pack up his father's things." She gave Tessa a meaningful look. "His father just died, you know."
Tessa sighed.
"I know."
She paused a beat.
"If you're not with Brock, why did you break up with Tommy?" "I've been thinking about ending things with him for a couple of weeks. The time it seemed right."
Tessa's eyes narrowed.
"So, you and Brock, you're not together?"
Ainsley thought about the kisses they'd shared the night before, and how much she'd enjoyed them. Then she thought about her realization that she loved him. Still, they weren't together.
"No, we're not."
"Really? Because Tommy told me that you cheated on him with Brock."
Ainsley's eyes widened in shock. "That's a lie, Tessa."
She'd ended things with Tommy way before things had heated up with Brock. She definitely hadn't cheated on Tommy.
"What else did he tell you?"
Tessa appraised her.
"That the two of you have talked about marriage."
Ainsley's mouth fell open.
"That is not true."
Vehemence enveloped every word.
"We've never, not once, talked about marriage. We'd never even talked about being boyfriend-girlfriend."
Why was Tommy telling people these lies? "Well," Tessa said, "Tommy had a different story." Placing one hand on her hip, Ainsley huffed out a breath.
"Who are you going to believe, me or Tommy?"
Tessa's lips flattened.
"I haven't decided yet. All I know is that you looked pretty dang happy when those flowers arrived, and you were still with Tommy then." "Did you tell him about the flowers?" Ainsley asked. Tessa didn't answer, but she didn't have to. It was written all over her face. "Why did you do that, Tessa?" Scowling, Tessa said, "I thought he should know." Since when had Tessa joined the relationship police? Ainsley had thought Tessa was her friend. Now she wasn't so sure. "I've got to get to work," Tessa said, before turning and walking away. Ainsley watched her go, her heart pounding with anger, at Tommy and at Tessa, but mostly at Tommy. All day long, Ainsley couldn't get Tommy's lies out of her head, especially when she looked Tessa's way and Tessa frowned at her. She had to resolve this with Tommy, today. The moment she got home, she sent Tommy a text. She had considered calling him, but the thought of arguing with him just made her tired. She reread the text before hitting send. It said, "Why did you lie to Tessa about us? Why did you say I cheated on you? Who else did you tell these lies to?" Confrontation wasn't something she enjoyed, and her heart pounded as she waited for him to reply. 10 minutes later, he did. His text said, "It wasn't a lie. You broke up with me because of your neighbor. Why can't you admit that?" Gritting her teeth in frustration, she forced herself to slowly breathe as she thought about a reply. Yes, she was in love with Brock, but that wasn't why she'd broken up with Tommy. She knew that. She was confident in that. Still, she stewed in her fury and frustration for several minutes before deciding that she wasn't going to give Tommy the satisfaction of an answer. Taking her time to get ready before going to see Brock, she changed into jeans and a t-shirt, touched up her makeup, then stared at herself in the mirror. What did Brock see when he looked at her? Surely he no longer saw the girl she once was, the girl who pestered him and Wes. Remembering their kiss the night before, she smiled. No, he recognized that she was a grown woman. But was he interested in anything beyond friendship and a few kisses? Only one way to find out. Today she would try to suss out his feelings for her, see where he saw them going. Anticipation and hope blossomed inside her as she walked out her front door. Ainsley was halfway across the grass between her house and Brock's when she heard a voice call her name, a voice she recognized as Tommy's. Spinning around, she saw him walking away from his car parked at the curb and toward her. He was wearing dress slacks and a button-up shirt. Must have just come from work. "What do you want?" she called out, not trying to hide the annoyance she felt. "I just want to talk to you." He continued walking in her direction, but when he was 8 feet away, she put up her hand, and he halted. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Come on, Ains, let's be civil." Her eyebrows shot up. "After you lied about me?" "Don't be so dramatic. Besides, I never lied." Her head tilted as her eyes narrowed to slits. "You told Tessa that I cheated on you. That's not true." "If telling yourself that gets you through the day." Fuming, she glared at him. "You also told her that we talked about marriage. That is a flat-out lie." He grinned. "Okay, maybe that was wishful thinking, but Tessa doesn't know that." So, he wanted Tessa, and who knew who else, to believe his lies. Fury fueled her words as a scoffing sound left her mouth. "There's no way I would ever marry you." Anger and humiliation flashed in his eyes. Good. Maybe he would leave her alone now. Shouting drew Brock to his living room window. That's when he saw Ainsley standing in the middle of her yard, arguing with Tommy. With his window closed, Brock couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told him they were both upset. Not about to leave Ainsley on her own with a man yelling at her, he decided to step in. Rushing to the door, his only concern was Ainsley. He flung the door open and stepped onto the porch, pausing a moment to assess the situation. That's when he heard what they were saying. "I wouldn't marry you if you paid me," Tommy said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a cheating lowlife. Look at you. You were on your way to see him now, weren't you?" Brock watched Ainsley, and at that moment she turned. Their eyes met, the hurt and anger on her face unmistakable. From the moment Brock had met Tommy, he hadn't liked him.
Now that animosity exploded. All the sunlight he normally saw in Ainsley had gone out, and he put the blame squarely on Tommy. Without stopping to think, he strode to Ainsley's side, glaring at Tommy the entire way. "Oh," Tommy said, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Look who's joining the party." "You're not welcome here," Brock said, his voice deep and menacing. "You need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere, caveman." Caveman? What? Ignoring the insult, Brock clenched his jaw, then felt Ainsley's hand slip into his. Warmed by her touch, he gently squeezed to let her know he had her back. Tommy's gaze went to their clasped hands, his face going scarlet. "You didn't cheat on me, huh? Don't make me laugh." An ugly expression grew on his face. "Who else did you cheat with, huh, Ainsley? Do I need to take a poll of all the men in Rosebridge? Get a count? I'm not sure I can count that high." "That's enough," Brock roared. "Apologize to the lady." "Or what?" Tommy turned his attention to Brock. "You're gonna make me? I'd like to see that." "Ignore him," Ainsley murmured. Brock was used to people talking smack to him, usually on the field, and that didn't bother him. But this was different. This was insulting Ainsley, the woman that he cared about more than he'd ever cared about a woman before. She was kind and selfless, beautiful inside and out. She didn't deserve a loser like Tommy saying such crude things about her, to her. "Apologize," Brock said through gritted teeth. "Now." Tommy grinned, then slowly shook his head. "You've got it backwards, bro. She needs to apologize to me." "Not likely," Brock muttered. Tommy looked at Ainsley, then he focused on Brock. "You two deserve each other, the caveman and the low-life cheating witch. She's the scum of the earth, Remington, the lowest of the low. I hope she doesn't give you some sort of disease." Adrenaline flooded Brock's veins. It was too much. He couldn't take it anymore. Dropping Ainsley's hand, Brock swiftly closed the distance between himself and Tommy. Then, in one smooth motion, his hand curled into a fist before coming up in a powerful swing that landed right in Tommy's face. Tommy bounced against the ground, blood gushing from his nose. The moment Brock's fist had connected with Tommy's face, Brock knew he had made a serious mistake. Brock couldn't deny that it felt good to put the man in his place, but this could spell trouble. Stepping next to Tommy, Brock held out his hand. Swallowing his pride, he forced a smile. "Sorry about that, bro." Knocking Brock's hand away, Tommy glared at him, and after several moments he drew in a breath and sputtered, "I'm going to have you arrested for assault." Oh no, Brock thought. No, no, no. This was exactly what Brock had feared the moment he'd realized his mistake. This was bad. This was very, very bad. Maybe even catastrophic. Ainsley was in shock. What had just happened? What was going to happen now? What if Tommy meant it? What if Brock was arrested? All because he was standing up for her. Wanting to play it safe, she fell to her knees beside Tommy. "Are you okay?" "No," he said, his voice thick with fury. "Your boyfriend broke my nose." "I'm so sorry, Tommy. Please don't have him arrested. Please." "We're past that now," he said. Then his lips slowly lifted in a cruel smile, and Ainsley had the sick feeling that he'd set this up to get just this result. No, she thought, he wouldn't do that, would he? Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Standing, Ainsley looked around, wondering who had called the police, but then she saw a neighbor peeking out from behind a curtain. Worry streamed through her. What would happen now? Chapter 14. "I want to press charges," Tommy said to the officer. Ainsley could hear him, even though he was standing 30 feet away. "The man's in the NFL," Tommy added. "Do you see how big he is? He could have killed me." There were 3 police cars and an ambulance parked in the street in front of their houses. The officer talking to Tommy looked at Brock, who stood next to Ainsley. Ainsley glanced at Brock, but his expression was unreadable. His hands were in the pockets of his jeans, and he stared straight ahead, not looking at Ainsley, not looking toward the police cruisers, which she feared he would soon be sitting in. "We'll figure this out," she murmured. He grunted, but didn't reply. Not wanting to consider the unthinkable, nevertheless, she wanted to be prepared. "What should we do if—" She let her words trail off. "If I'm arrested?" he asked, finally looking her square in the face. His brown eyes had turned the color of chocolate, and Ainsley could only imagine how stressful this had to be for him, especially on top of losing his father. What would an arrest mean for his career? What if he was sentenced to jail? Horror blasted through her. She had to help him. "Tell me what to do," she said, frantic with worry. "Tommy seems pretty intent on making me pay," he said, his voice low. That seemed clear to her as well. Brock pulled his phone out of his pocket and handed it to her. "If I'm—" A muscle worked in his jaw. "Arrested? Call my agent, Steve Thornton. He's in my contacts. He'll know what to do." He gave her the passcode for his phone. She tucked his phone into her back pocket. Then she intertwined her fingers with his, and when she heard him sigh, she was glad she was there. Then again, if she wasn't, none of this would have happened. Tensing as she let the blame settle on her shoulders, she turned her focus away from herself and to what was happening with Tommy and the police officers. Brock had blown it. He knew better than to punch someone. He was big and strong. A hit from him could do real damage. And even though he'd been on Ainsley's property, Brock had stepped toward Tommy. Tommy had said vile things, but he'd never physically threatened him or Ainsley. Self-defense wouldn't fly. Now he would have to face the consequences of his impulsive act. Even so, he couldn't let what Tommy said to Ainsley stand. What he'd said, what he'd called her, it was unacceptable. But he shouldn't have touched Tommy. He should have found some other way. Regret, hot and poisonous, wrapped around him, and when he saw one of the officers walking toward him, he pulled his hand from Ainsley's and relaxed his stance. No reason for the officer to feel threatened by him. "Let's talk over here," the officer said, pointing to an area well away from Tommy. Brock walked to the spot the officer indicated, then waited for the man to speak. "The gentleman over there says you assaulted him," the officer said, pointing in Tommy's direction. Brock read the tag on the pocket of the man's shirt, Officer Lyons, and resisted the urge to contradict his description of Tommy as a gentleman. "What's your side of the story?" Lyons asked. Knowing it was best to not say anything at all, Brock shook his head. "I'd rather not say anything without my lawyer present." Lyons sighed. "Turn around." Brock did, and without being asked, he put his hands behind his back, and then he felt the metal of the cuffs as they encircled his wrists. Then Lyons patted him down. "You have the right to remain silent." Brock tuned out the rest of Lyons' recitation of his Miranda rights, and instead twisted his head to look at Ainsley. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, and he couldn't miss the tears tracking down her face. Feeling like he'd failed her, failed his father, his team, everyone, Brock let Officer Lyons lead him to the police cruiser, and when they passed Tommy, he ignored him. Brock was seated in the back seat of the police cruiser, the first time in his life that he'd been in trouble with the law. Tears streamed down Ainsley's face. She could not believe what was happening. Paralyzed with fear and uncertainty, she tried to ignore the stares of the neighbors who stood on the sidewalk watching the spectacle unfolding before them. A few of them even had their phones up, documenting everything. "I'll be on the news tonight," she thought dully. "Brock Remington, tight end for the Sacramento Vipers, arrested for assault, because of me." The police cruiser that held Brock pulled away from the curb, and another officer approached her. Afraid that she would say something wrong, her mouth went dry. "Ma'am," the man said, "I'm Officer Cassidy." Nodding, she didn't reply. "You witnessed the altercation?" "Yes." Her voice was a whisper. "What happened?" She didn't want to get Brock into any more trouble, but she wasn't going to lie either. Maybe she could get them to understand that it wasn't Brock's fault, that Tommy had egged him on. "I broke up with Tommy the other day," she began, "and he was jealous. He accused me of cheating on him. He said some ugly things to me." "And then?" "Brock was just trying to protect me." "Did you feel threatened by Mr. Zimmerman?" Ainsley looked toward Tommy. Had she felt threatened by him? Not with Brock by her side. No one could hurt her with him there to protect her. "Tommy approached me after I told him to leave. He wouldn't leave." "Did Mr. Zimmerman threaten Mr. Remington before Mr. Remington hit him, or did Mr. Remington step forward first?" Fear of saying the wrong thing squeezed Ainsley's chest. Clear as day, she remembered Brock taking 2 large steps toward Tommy before punching him. But she couldn't say that. That would condemn him. Panic swelled within her. I... She shook her head, and her lips clamped shut. Officer Cassidy grimaced, then he turned and walked away. Not waiting to be questioned further, and not wanting to face Tommy again, Ainsley strode briskly back to her house, went inside, and locked the door. The next thing she did was call Brock's agent, desperately hopeful that he could get this straightened out. After explaining what was going on, she hung up and began pacing the room. Chapter 15. As the afternoon turned to evening, and Ainsley hadn't heard anything from Brock or heard back from Brock's agent, she became frantic with worry. What was happening? She had to know. Using Brock's phone, she called his agent as she sat on the couch and stared at the wall. "This is Steve," the man answered. "Hi, Steve. This is Ainsley Hunter. I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to find out what was happening with Brock." "Sure. I found a good local attorney for him, but the man he assaulted wants to press charges. Evidently his nose was broken." Will he go to jail?" Steve sighed. "It's hard to say, but it's certainly possible. An assault charge is serious." Ainsley still held on to a sliver of hope that Brock could get out of this. "But Tommy was on my property, and he wouldn't leave." "Earlier you told me that Brock walked toward Tommy before hitting him, and that Tommy never physically threatened either one of you." "Right." "It sounds like Brock initiated the attack. That's not allowed, even if someone is on your property and won't leave. In that case, you should call the police." Steve paused. "I'm sorry, Ainsley. I'm sure Brock's attorney will do everything he can, but I don't want to give you false hope." Closing her eyes in abject despair, she said, "Thank you. Please let me know if you hear anything." "I will." She disconnected the call and set Brock's phone on her coffee table. Then she stood and went to the front window, staring at the spot where Brock had punched Tommy. No one was there now, but she could vividly see the whole thing play out in her mind. There had to be something she could do. Had to be. Chewing on the inside of her lip, she tried to think of anything she could do to help Brock, but she kept drawing a blank. If Tommy hadn't come over, she thought, none of this would have happened. It's all Tommy's fault, and now he wants to press charges. That's when it hit her. If she could convince Tommy not to press charges, then maybe it would all go away. Fresh hope poured over her, and without waiting another moment, she grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter and raced to her car. 10 minutes later, she stood on Tommy's front porch, her finger pressing the doorbell. When she heard his footsteps approaching the door, Ainsley had to force down the anger that had been building inside her ever since he'd shown up at her house. The door opened. Tommy's eyes widened. "Ainsley." Despite the fact that both of his eyes had dark bruises and a bandage covered the bridge of his nose, the mere sight of him brought on a fresh bout of fury, but Ainsley shoved down her anger. She had to stay focused on her purpose for being there. "Can we talk?" He smiled. "Sure." Then he opened the door wider and invited her in. She stepped inside, the space familiar. Tommy gestured with his head toward the couch, and when Ainsley nodded, he sat. She joined him, but sat as far from him as possible. Wanting to start the conversation on a conciliatory note, she asked, "How's your nose? Are you doing okay?" Tommy's hand went to his face and he grimaced. "It hurts. A lot. It was nothing that he didn't deserve, but Ainsley couldn't say that out loud. Instead, she said, "Brock didn't mean to hurt you, Tommy." A scoffing sound came from his mouth. "Could have fooled me. He stepped right toward me before taking a swing. And don't forget, he tackles people for a living. Don't think for a minute that he didn't mean to do this." Ainsley could see this was going to be more difficult than she'd anticipated. Licking her lips, she tried to come up with another strategy. "Why are you here?" Tommy asked. Deciding honesty was the best policy, she said. "I'm here to beg you to drop the charges against Brock. Please, Tommy. He just lost his father, for heaven's sake. Give the man a break." Tommy stared at her. "I'm worried about you, Ainsley." Brow furrowing, Ainsley tilted her head. "Why?" "The man has a temper." He touched the bridge of his nose again. "Clearly. What if he loses it with you?" That was not going to happen. Ainsley was certain of that. "I appreciate your concern, Tommy." That was a total lie. "But what can I do to convince you not to press charges?" Tommy looked thoughtful, like he'd never considered that before, and after several moments he spoke. "There may be a solution." Would he reconsider pressing charges? Hope ignited within her. "What? What's the solution?" She hadn't meant to sound so eager, but she couldn't help herself. He lifted his chin. "You're not going to like this, but I'm only doing it because I care about you so much." Wary, Ainsley said, "What are you talking about?" "I'll drop the charges on one condition." Heart pounding with optimism, Ainsley nearly held her breath. At this point, she would do anything. The thought of Brock going to jail made her stomach churn. "What? What's your condition?" "I'll drop the charges if—" He paused. "If you agree to stop seeing him." "What?" The words shot out of her mouth. Then, fearing he would withdraw his offer, she clamped her lips shut. "In addition," Tommy said, his expression calm, "you can't tell him about our agreement." Her heart plummeted. The choice was between losing all hope of a future with Brock in exchange for keeping him out of jail. "That's my one and only offer, Ainsley, and it expires in 5 minutes. She couldn't catch her breath. Desperate for a sliver of hope, she scrambled for something to say as tears filled her eyes. "But he's my friend." Compassion flashed across Tommy's face. "You can remain friends, but there must never be anything beyond friendship." This was the last thing Ainsley had expected, and she didn't know if she could agree to it. But she didn't have a choice, did she? If this would keep Brock out of jail, then she had to do it. There was simply no other option. Sure, Brock's attorney might manage to keep Brock out of jail, but the assault would always be on his record, always be there to haunt him. If Tommy dropped the charges, it would all go away. It would be as if it had never happened. Except for the ramifications for her. Was she willing to make this sacrifice for Brock, the man she'd fallen in love with? Picturing his face, Ainsley knew she would do whatever it took to fix this. Then, letting her logical side take over, she reminded herself that there was never going to be a future for her with Brock beyond friendship anyway, so maybe this wasn't so bad. Well, it destroyed any hope for a romantic relationship, so it was actually beyond awful. But if it would keep Brock out of jail, something he faced only because of her, then the sacrifice was worth it, right? "Clock's ticking, Ains." Pressure squeezed her chest. She had to decide, and she had to decide now. She filled her lungs, briefly held her breath, then exhaled in a loud whoosh. "Okay." The word was barely audible. Tommy grinned. "What? I couldn't hear you." "I said okay. You have a deal." This time the words were loud and clear. She tried to stay focused on the moment, rather than think about the way her future was crashing and burning before her very eyes. Nodding in obvious satisfaction, he slapped his legs once. "All right." Then he frowned. "How can I be sure you'll keep your end of the agreement?" In all reality, once the charges were dropped, they probably couldn't be reinstated. Ainsley was confident Brock's attorney would make sure of that, but she needed Tommy to keep his end of the deal.
Because I keep my word, she said. It's called integrity. And that was true too. Even if she could double-cross him by agreeing to the deal, and then once Brock was free and clear, backing out of it, she wouldn't do that. It wasn't in her nature. Good to hear, Ains, but I have another little piece of insurance to keep you honest. Wow, he'd really thought this through, which only bolstered her original thought that he'd planned this all out ahead of time. What? She tried not to spit the word. He took his phone out of his pocket, and then he pulled up YouTube. Watch this. She took the phone from his outstretched hand and watched a replay of the whole incident. Evidently, a neighbor had filmed their altercation and then uploaded it. There had already been over 1 million views. Bile churned in Ainsley's stomach. Seeing Brock hit Tommy in the face, then Tommy fall to the ground as blood poured from his nose, it was horrible to watch. And she'd been the one Tommy had been insulting. None of that had been picked up on the recording. Instead, it clearly showed that Brock was the aggressor, that he had cold-cocked Tommy, and Brock looked huge compared to Tommy. No one would feel sorry for Brock. No one but her. She handed the phone back to him. If you break our deal, he said as he tucked the phone into his pocket, I'll bring civil charges against Brock Remington for pain, suffering, humiliation, injury. You name it. A jury will eat it up. The big NFL star punching out the little guy. He grinned. That would be me. I'll win, and everyone will know that a jury of his peers agreed that Brock is a bully. He could even get kicked out of the NFL. Horrified that any of that could happen, Ainsley fought back tears. If she could keep that from happening to Brock, then she would, no matter the cost. And the only way to assure that was to keep her relationship with him strictly platonic. The memory of him kissing her the night before filled her mind. She'd never enjoyed a simple kiss as much as she'd enjoyed the kisses with him. Without a doubt, being in love with him made all the difference, but she would have to put that aside, to forget the way she felt. She would do it. For Brock. Heart aching with sorrow, she again reminded herself that there was never going to be a future for the two of them. He had his life in Sacramento, a life filled with NFL games, parties, and gorgeous women. There was no room for her in his life. If she could only remember that, this would be much easier to get through. Who was she kidding? This was going to be torture. Ainsley, Tommy said, his voice nasally due to his broken nose. What? I'm not going to have to file a civil suit, am I? No. The word was immediate. No, you're not. I promise. His grin, accentuated by his black eyes, looked evil. Good. When are you going to drop the charges? His lips twisted into a smirk. It's getting a little late now, but I'll go in the morning. Outrage built inside her, but she drew in a slow breath to calm herself. She was so close to the goal line. She couldn't do anything to blow it. Standing, she tried to smile, but she couldn't quite get there. She turned and walked to the door. Thanks for stopping by, Tommy said as he followed her. And remember, don't tell him about our deal. Without another word, Ainsley opened the door, walked to her car, and drove away. Chapter 16. That's all he wants? Brock asked his attorney as they sat in a small room at the jailhouse the next day. A letter of apology and for me to pay his medical bills? And then this all goes away? That's right, Ted Michelson said. Confused as to why Tommy had decided to drop the charges, Brock was just glad he could put it behind him. All right, let's do it. 2 hours later, he was home. After showering, the first thing he did was go to Ainsley's, but she was apparently still at work. Eager to see her, he couldn't even send her a text. She still had his phone. Keeping himself busy with packing, every hour he walked next door to see if she'd gotten home yet. She typically parked in the garage. A little after 3 o'clock, she was there. At the look of joy on her face when she opened her door and saw him standing there, his first instinct was to pull her into his arms and kiss her. He didn't have the chance. She threw her arms around him and hugged him tight. I'm so happy to see you. Her voice was strained.
Sliding his arms around her, he held her tight and he never wanted to let her go. Sitting in that jail cell, he'd come to realize how much she meant to him, how much he wanted her to be part of his life. And now that they'd put the unfortunate incident with Tommy behind them, the future was bright with possibilities. Ainsley was beyond thrilled that Brock was actually there, free. Tommy had kept his end of the bargain, and for that she was grateful. Regardless, she was certain he had orchestrated the whole thing to get the end result he wanted, Ainsley and Brock only ever being friends. The reminder that there was no hope for a future with Brock was like ice water pouring over her. She unwound her arms from around him, her happiness dimmed. Ignoring the ache in her heart, she invited him in. "Have you eaten? When did you get home? Tell me everything." They sat side by side on the couch, angled to face each other, and when Brock took her hand, Ainsley convinced herself it was okay, that friends could hold hands as a way to comfort each other. Besides, she wasn't ready to reject him just yet. Pushing a bright smile onto her lips, she waited to hear what Brock had to say. Then a new idea jumped into her head. What if his freedom had nothing to do with Tommy? That would make her deal with Tommy null and void. "Tommy dropped the charges," Brock said. The reality of the situation plowed through her, and it took all of the discipline she could muster to keep smiling. "That's great." "I know. I'm surprised, though. All he asked was that I write a letter of apology to him and pay his medical bills." That wasn't all he asked, she thought. "So I did it," Brock continued, "and now I'm good to go. My attorney made sure the charges couldn't be reinstated, so now there's nothing to worry about." He grinned, his brown eyes glowing. "I'm free." Lead settled in Ainsley's stomach. Invisible shackles circled her ankles and wrists, but most especially her heart. She was anything but free. "I'm so happy for you, Brock." And she was. She was just sad for herself. For a split second, she considered telling him everything and breaking the deal with Tommy. But then she pictured Brock being sued by Tommy and dragged into court, the whole world watching as he defended himself. Or maybe Brock could settle out of court. That could work. That could be a way around this. Hope, bright and clear, blossomed inside her. But she'd made an agreement. Tommy had done what he'd promised, and now she needed to do what she'd promised. Her parents had always emphasized honesty and integrity. What would they think of her if she broke a verbal contract? What would she think of herself? Frustrated beyond reason, she focused on the good that had come out of this. Brock's name had been cleared. He wouldn't go to jail. "Remember, Ainsley," she reminded herself, "there's no future with you and Brock anyway, so what difference does keeping your relationship platonic matter anyway?" Clinging to that logic, she smiled at Brock. "I want to take you to dinner tonight, to celebrate my freedom." Panic seized her. She couldn't go on a date. What if Tommy saw them together? But he'd said she could still be friends with Brock. Hatred for Tommy slid through her, taking up residence deep inside her. She'd broken up with him, but he was controlling her life. "What do you say?" Brock asked, his face filled with expectation. Ainsley hesitated. "Would this be a date?" Yes." Swallowing over the knot that formed in her throat, Ainsley gently pulled her hands from his as she shook her head. "I don't know if that's a good idea." Brock's eyebrows yanked together. "Why not?" Hating Tommy with every fiber of her being, she frowned. That is, I'm not interested in dating you. I just want to be friends." The bitterness of the lie made her want to rinse her mouth out with vinegar. That would improve the taste. "Oh." He seemed to deflate right in front of her. Desperate to bring the happiness back to his eyes, she added, "Well, maybe we could go somewhere, as friends." That wasn't ideal, but Brock would take it. After the kisses he and Ainsley had shared, he'd gotten the distinct feeling that she was as attracted to him as he was to her. What had changed? Then he knew. Seeing him hit Tommy must have turned her off, killed any attraction she had for him. It was his own fault. Yes, he'd been freed of any charges, but he'd lost Ainsley in the process. He'd blown everything, destroyed any chance he had with her. Wait, maybe he hadn't. Maybe he could prove to her that his reaction had been out of character for him, that he was actually a good guy. Fresh hope suffused him, and he smiled. He stood. I know just the place. Ainsley stood as well, and he fought the nearly overwhelming desire to draw her into his arms and kiss her. She'd made it clear she wasn't interested in that, and he needed to respect her boundaries. But knowing she was just out of reach made him want her all the more.
Chapter 17. Red Apple Diner? Ainsley asked with a smile as Brock pulled into a parking space.
Why not? I know you love their shakes, and from what I remember, their burgers are pretty good too.
She glanced at him, loving the strength in his profile, loving everything about him. This was torture, being with him without being able to tell him how she felt. She comforted herself with the fact that he was flying back to Sacramento in 2 days, but that was no comfort at all. While she'd been musing, he'd come around to her door, and now she let him help her out. But once they were both standing outside his car, she reluctantly removed her hand from his. I'm starving, she said, as a way to cover her action, but she had no appetite at all.
Good, I am too.
They walked side by side, and once inside, he led her to a just-vacated booth. It was Friday evening, and the place was busy. A server cleared the dishes away and wiped down the table, then set menus in front of them. Glancing around, afraid Tommy would somehow see them, Ainsley wasn't able to relax.
What's wrong? Brock asked. You seem, I don't know, tense.
He was exactly right, but she had to pretend everything was fine. No, I'm just, I don't know. She couldn't come up with a convincing lie. Brock knew what the problem was. She was embarrassed to be seen with him. Everyone in town had surely seen the video of him punching Tommy. He looked like the caveman Tommy had accused him of being. Shame poured over him like acid. Being aggressive was part of his job. If he wasn't, he would be sidelined or traded. But in real life, among civilized people, what he had done wasn't acceptable.
I'm sorry, Ainsley. His voice was soft so that the neighboring diners couldn't hear.
Her eyes widened. Sorry about what?
About what happened. With Tommy. I shouldn't have lost my cool like that. It was a mistake. One that I'll always regret.
His eyebrows bunched.
Will you ever be able to forgive me?
Tears filled her eyes, and she placed her hand over his. Oh, Brock, there's nothing to forgive. You were standing up for me. I'm just sorry I ever met Tommy. That wasn't what he'd been expecting. He took her hand in his and lifted it to his mouth, then gently placed a kiss against her tender skin. She gasped, then yanked her hand away and looked at the other diners before staring at her lap. What the? He thought. She might say there was nothing to forgive, but clearly she was ashamed of him, of people thinking there was something between them. Hurt, Brock picked up his menu and pretended to study the options. Ainsley hated this, hated that she had to watch herself around Brock. Desperate to tell him everything, to let him know this wasn't his fault, she opened her mouth to speak. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw someone approaching them. Turning her head, Ainsley saw Tessa stop beside their table. Panic swelled within her. Had Tessa seen Brock kissing her hand? Would she report it to Tommy? Hey, Ainsley, Tessa said, a fake smile on her mouth. Hey. Looking at Brock, Ainsley said, I work with Tessa at Dr. Harris's office. Then she smiled at Tessa. Tessa, this is Brock Remington. Tessa held out her hand, and Brock took it in his.
Nice to meet you, Tessa.
You too. Tessa retrieved her hand. I was sorry to hear about your father. Sadness slid into Brock's eyes.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
How's your... Tessa glanced at Brock's right hand. Your fist. Mortified that Tessa would say that right to his face, Ainsley wanted to jump up and drag Tessa away.
But before she had the chance to put her impulse into action, she heard Brock say, "I'm ashamed about what I did." Brock's shoulders were hunched, and he was shaking his head. Ainsley looked at Tessa, who seemed unimpressed with Brock's remorse. Then again, she was friends with Tommy, and Ainsley knew how bad Tommy's face looked. "You should be," Tessa said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You broke the man's nose and blackened both of his eyes." "That's enough, Tessa," Ainsley heard herself say, her voice loud and firm. Tessa's lips flattened as she looked at Ainsley, then she stormed away. "Let's get out of here," Brock said. Ainsley leapt to her feet, eager to get away from everyone's judgmental stares. A few minutes later, they were back on the road. "I'm sorry about Tessa," Ainsley said. "She and Tommy are friends." He frowned. "I figured as much." He reached over and took her hand, and she didn't pull away. She couldn't. It felt too good to have her hand in his. "Thanks for standing up for me." Glad she'd done at least that. She wanted to do more, but had no clue where to start. "Let's go to my place and order a pizza," Brock said. Then he chuckled. "We can do some more packing while we're there." "That's a great idea." That was something she could do to help him. It was something a friend would do. But she wanted to be more than friends. Desperately. "You like packing?" "Not particularly, but—" "What?" I want to help you. And kiss you," she thought, "and tell you that I love you." He smiled at her. "You're the most giving person I know, Ainsley." She didn't know about that, but she was flattered he thought so. Wanting to keep the conversation less personal, even though her hand was still in his, she asked, "How much packing is left?" "Not a whole lot." "That's good." "Yeah. I've arranged for Goodwill to come on Monday to haul away all the boxes and furniture. I've already shipped the items I'm keeping to Sacramento. Then I'll have a cleaning service scrub the place down before I put the house on the market." It was all so final. He would be gone in less than 48 hours, and he would never come back. She clung to his hand as her aching heart began to shatter. Brock was surprised that Ainsley was still letting him hold her hand, especially after the way she'd reacted to the kiss on her hand at the diner. Then again, they were alone now. No one could see her with him, so maybe she was able to contain her embarrassment. And, despite everything, she was still willing to help him pack. Amazed by her selfless nature, he knew she was everything he wanted in a woman. Startled by the sudden realization, his mind raced with a way to win her heart. Not sure if he ever could, he scolded himself for thinking everything should always go his way. He'd been beyond blessed in his life, but that didn't mean he wouldn't have disappointments. He'd experienced plenty of setbacks in his life, but losing Ainsley was a defeat he wasn't sure he could accept. Chapter 18. "This pizza is so good," Ainsley said, before taking another bite of her slice. The crust was just the right thickness, the cheese melted in her mouth, and the chunks of sausage, pepperoni, ham, and bell pepper were perfect. Brock swallowed the mouthful he'd been chewing. "Better than the burgers at Red Apple Diner?" Trying to forget that they'd even gone there, she nodded. "Definitely." "I think so too." She smiled at him as they continued eating, and when they were done, she helped him clean up before they went into the spare bedroom to finish packing the odds and ends that were left. "I'm glad this is only a 2-bedroom house," she said, as she ran packing tape over the top of the box she'd filled. Then she added the box to the stack in the hallway before coming back in the room. Leaning against the wall, she watched as Brock took the last few items down from the high shelf in the closet. Brock laughed as he turned to face her. "Right? I tried to get my dad to let me buy him a brand new place, but he refused. Now I'm glad." "Your dad was such a great guy, Brock." Her smile was soft, and the moment seemed right. He had to kiss her. Had to. In 2 strides, he was in front of her, with only inches separating them. Cupping her face in his hands, he studied her. Her blue eyes were wide. When he looked into those eyes, all he saw was a woman without guile, a woman who was trusting and kind and good, a woman he was falling in love with. Needing to feel her mouth against his, her body in his arms, he gazed at her as his mouth descended toward hers. Ainsley was paralyzed by his gaze, by his very presence. Her love for him filled the whole room, and it was physically impossible for her to turn away. Her heart wouldn't let her, no matter how much her mind told her she should. "Brock," her mind cried, "I love you so much." Then his mouth was on hers, and her arms wound around his neck as he moved to circle her waist. Melting against him, she savored this moment, memorizing the way it felt to be in the security of his powerful embrace, to have his mouth claim hers, to feel loved, because she knew this would be the last time she saw him. She couldn't take it any longer. She couldn't spend another day with him, not when she knew there could be no more than friendship between them. Early the next morning she would leave. She didn't know where she would go, but she would pack a bag and leave town, and she wouldn't come back until she knew Brock had flown back to Sacramento. When he released her from his embrace, his eyes on her, Ainsley's chest tightened and her head pounded. Keeping all this emotion in was doing terrible things to her body. Desperate to tell him everything, she couldn't break her promise. She just couldn't. And even if she was willing to, fear of what would happen to Brock stopped her from telling him the truth. The pounding in her head increased. "I don't feel well," she said. "I need to." She glanced toward the hallway. "I need to go." Concern filled Brock's face. "Are you sure? Maybe I can help you." There was absolutely nothing Brock could do to help her. She'd made this agreement with Tommy, and she would have to deal with it on her own. She shook her head. "No." Then she smiled. "Thank you, though." Brock ran his finger down her jaw, and she nearly burst into sobs at his touch. "Let me know if you need anything, okay?" Afraid to open her mouth for fear that she would burst into hysterics, Ainsley nodded. Then with a final smile, she turned and hurried to the front door. Brock followed Ainsley to the door, worried about her. She'd been on edge ever since he'd been released from jail. Then his thoughts ricocheted back to the word jail. He'd been in jail. That was not the kind of place Ainsley had ever been. He was probably the first person she knew who had been arrested. No wonder she was having a hard time with this. What must she think of him? Clenching his jaw, he opened the door for her, and when she threw him a sad smile in lieu of saying goodbye, he feared there would be no coming back from this. Chapter 19. Before the sun came up the next morning, Ainsley was on the road. She didn't know how early Brock got up, but she didn't want to take a chance on running into him before she'd gotten away. It was Saturday, so at least she hadn't had to miss work. Now, as she drove west along the interstate, she forced her thoughts away from Brock and to where she was headed. An image of the Pacific Ocean filled her mind. Her parents had taken her and Wes to the Oregon coast when they were kids, and she'd loved it. The sound of the waves, the cry of the seagulls, the salt-filled air. Yes, that's exactly what she needed. They'd stayed in Cannon Beach. That's where she would go. With the destination in mind, her heart lifted, and she even managed to smile. First thing Saturday morning, Brock went for a run. He'd missed his workouts this week, but he didn't regret the time he'd spent in Rosebridge. He'd needed this time to say goodbye to his father. As he jogged along the familiar streets, his mind went to Ainsley. After he showered, he would go to her house and have a frank talk with her, find out what was going on. He was leaving the next day, and before he flew back to Sacramento, he needed to clarify where the relationship was headed. Smiling as he remembered their kiss, he knew he wanted to pursue a relationship with her. Then her words filled his mind, the words telling him that she didn't want the same thing, that she only wanted friendship. Yet her reaction to his kiss belied those words. Confused by the mixed messages, he was determined to find a way to change her mind. Confident that this would all work out, he continued his run. An hour later, showered and feeling good, Brock walked over to Ainsley's house. As far as he knew, she wasn't working, but he'd never confirmed what her plans were, So when he knocked on her door and no one answered, he was disappointed but not terribly surprised. Eager to talk to her, he sent her a text as he stood on her porch. It said, "Would love to see you. When will you be home?" Then he walked back to his house, ready to finish up packing his dad's garage. Ainsley heard her phone chime a text as she drove. An image of Brock's face jumped into her mind, and she wondered if he'd discovered yet that she'd left. On the other hand, it could be from Tommy, warning her on the kiss Tessa may have witnessed the night before. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone from the cup holder and glanced at the screen. The text was from Brock, but she couldn't read it in the short glance. With her lips hovering between a smile and a frown, she set her phone back in the cup holder, then she looked at her gas gauge. At the next gas station, she would pull off and fill up her tank while also checking her messages, and while she was at it, she would arrange for a place to stay that night. 20 minutes later, she pulled next to a gas pump. After her tank was filled, she parked in front of the mini-mart, anxious yet apprehensive to read Brock's text. She read his message twice. He wanted to see her, would love to see her. Devastated that wouldn't happen, she felt heat building behind her eyes. Blinking rapidly to clear the tears that insisted on filling her eyes, she sighed, then typed a response. It said, "I needed time to think, so I've gone out of town. I'm sorry I didn't tell you goodbye." Finger poised over the send button, she feared being drawn into a discussion with him. If he pressed her for more, would she break? Would she tell him about the deal she'd made with Tommy? What would Brock do if he found out? Would he beat Tommy into unconsciousness? That would send Brock to prison for sure. He'd been so contrite about what had happened that she didn't really believe he would go after Tommy, but she couldn't take the chance. Besides, her mind was already made up. She'd made a promise, and she wasn't going to break it. She pressed send and mentally crossed her fingers that he would leave it at that. Next, she looked up hotels to stay in Cannon Beach, and after a few phone calls she found one with a vacancy, one right on the beach, a resort and spa. Booking it, she allowed a small smile to curve her lips. A room overlooking the ocean, a massage, and a walk on the beach. Yes, that was just what she needed. Then she turned off her phone. She didn't need the distraction of messages from Brock. After driving for 10 hours, she arrived in Cannon Beach in the late afternoon and drove straight to the resort. Climbing out of her car, she smiled, then she closed her eyes as she tilted her head back to soak up the sun. Drawing in a lungful of fresh ocean air, she sighed in contentment. 10 minutes later, she was checked into her room, and thanks to a cancellation, she was scheduled for a massage later that evening. She stood on her balcony overlooking the ocean, listening to the waves crashing onto the shore, then the hiss of the ocean as it slid across the sand. A sense of peace settled over her, and she knew leaving town had been the right thing to do. Despite that, she couldn't get Brock off of her mind. She went back into her room and took her phone from her purse before turning it on. Eager for some sort of contact with him, she waited while the phone booted up, and when it was done, she saw there were 2 messages. Tapping the icon, she nearly held her breath, then saw that both texts were from Brock. The first one said, "I need to talk to you." Then, "If you don't want me to contact you, I'll respect that. It was good seeing you. Take care of yourself." Her heart dropped. He thought she didn't care about him, that she wanted nothing to do with him. But why would he think otherwise? Just the day before, she told him she only wanted to be friends. And then when he'd kissed her the night before, she'd run home, telling him she didn't feel well. And today? Today she'd left town without so much as a goodbye. If he had done those things to her, she would be devastated, crushed, hurt beyond belief. What was wrong with her? How could she do that to the man she loved? Tears flooded her eyes, and she let them overflow her lashes and slide down her cheeks. She had to tell him how she felt, that she was in love with him, that she couldn't live without him. Then an image of Tommy, grinning with blackened eyes and a broken nose, filled her mind. Was it worth it to break her promise with him, just to satisfy the longings of her heart? Torn and confused, Ainsley headed to the beach, her mind in turmoil. Chapter 20. Brock was hurt. How could Ainsley leave town without saying goodbye? When had she decided to leave? Had she already made her plans when he'd kissed her the night before? Did she say she wasn't feeling well so that she could get away from him and put her plan into action? Why? Why had she left? Was what he'd done so unforgivable that she couldn't bear the sight of him? Hating himself for what he'd done, he set his suitcase on the bed. He'd finished packing up his dad's belongings, and he needed to get out of town, out of Rosebridge, away from any reminders of Ainsley Hunter. He had to get home. His flight wasn't scheduled until the next day, but he was ready to head to the airport now. There was no point in sticking around, no point in dragging out his anguish. He would get back to Sacramento, and then he would immerse himself in his training. There was no other solution. He finished packing his bag, then he walked out to his car. Ainsley walked along the shore, her feet bare, the waves rushing up her calves before retreating into the ocean. She hardly noticed the softness of the ocean foam as it curled around her bare legs. Her mind was on Brock and whether she could live with herself if she broke her deal with Tommy. Uncertain, Ainsley wished she could talk it over with Brock, but not telling him was part of the deal. Maybe she should call Wes. She told him about Dan Remington's death, but hadn't spoken to him since. Yes, she would call her big brother. Minutes later, she had him on the line. "What are you up to, Ainsley?" he asked after she greeted him. "What's that noise I hear?" Warmth toward her brother rushed through her. "Guess where I am?" He laughed. "I have no idea." "Okay, I'll tell you. Cannon Beach, in Oregon." She told him the name of the resort. "It's gorgeous here." "What are you doing there?" Then she told him everything. How Brock had come to town, how she'd realized that she was falling for him, how she'd broken up with Tommy, how Brock had punched Tommy. And then she told him about the deal she'd made. Dead silence, then, "Are you kidding me? He made you agree to that? That's blackmail, plain and simple, maybe even extortion." The vehemence in his voice shook her. Was he right? Had the deal been a form of blackmail? And if it was, what did that mean for her? "What should I do, Wes? I made a promise. I can't break my promise." A loud sigh came over the line. "Let me think about this, okay? I'll call you back later." "Okay, thank you. I love you." "Love you too." Ainsley tucked her phone back in her pocket and turned around, ready for her massage. 3 hours later, she was soaking in her bathroom's garden tub, her muscles pleasantly sore. It had been a long time since she'd had a massage, but her body felt loose and relaxed. It was after 7, and she was hungry. Was it only the night before that she'd been eating pizza with Brock, that he'd kissed her so passionately? Closing her eyes, she tried to empty her mind, to banish all thoughts of Brock, but her mind refused to cooperate. Instead, his face was front and center, and she could hardly stand it. Wes had yet to call her back, and she was getting increasingly desperate for direction. Frowning in resignation, she stood and grabbed a towel. "The water's getting cold anyway," she murmured as she dried off. After dressing, she called Wes, but his phone went to voicemail. "Wes," she said after the beep, "I'm really struggling here. Please call me back." Not up to facing anyone, she ordered room service, then went onto the balcony while she waited. Sunset was approaching, and the view was stunning. Orange and pink streaked the sky, the colors reflected in the waters of the Pacific. Soaking in the view, Ainsley felt a sense of peace, and she reveled in it because she knew it wouldn't last, not with the turmoil in her heart. A knock sounded on her door. Her stomach rumbled in reply, and she strode to the door, ravenous. She pulled the door open, then froze, paralyzed with shock. Chapter 21. "Hi, Ainsley," Brock said, barely able to suppress his smile. A myriad of emotions flitted across her face: shock, happiness, disbelief. Brock, how did you... This was better than he could have imagined. After Wes had called him and told him what was going on and where Ainsley was staying, he chartered a private plane so that he wouldn't waste a moment reaching her side. And now here he was, and there she was, looking as gorgeous as ever. He still couldn't believe what Tommy had done, what he'd made her promise in exchange for dropping the charges. She'd completely sacrificed herself for him. It was more than he would have expected from anyone, and it totally explained the way she'd been acting. He gazed at her, love for her settling deep into his soul. He'd known her for years, but had only gotten to know the real her over the past week, and he'd fallen for her, hard. Nothing was going to change that. Not threats from Tommy, not the distance between Rosebridge, Idaho and Sacramento, California, not even Ainsley's tendency to put everyone but herself first. "Are you going to invite me in?" he asked, his lips quirking up. "Yes," she said with a laugh. "Yes, of course." She stepped back to let him enter. "Nice digs," he said as he passed her, resisting the urge to drag her against him and kiss her senseless. She had no idea he knew the truth, and he didn't want to put her in an awkward position by making a move when she still thought she needed to keep him in the friend zone. "Thanks," Ainsley replied. "I like it here." Was this really happening? Was Brock really here? How had he found her? What was she going to do now? She still hadn't heard back from Wes. What would he tell her to do? Dang him for not getting back to her. A knock sounded at the door. "Are you expecting anyone?" Brock asked. Not able to wipe the stupid grin from her face, she nodded. "Yes, room service." He chuckled. "I'll take care of it." She watched as Brock accepted the tray and gave the man a tip. Then he set the tray on the desk before turning back to her. He smiled at her. "I'd like to take you somewhere for dinner." Oh boy, she thought, back to her original problem. Even if what Tommy had done was blackmail, she couldn't break their deal. She'd promised. That meant something to her. "What do you say?" he asked as he stepped closer to her, his voice low and sexy. "Will you go out with me?" Panic crashed over her. Why can't we eat here?" She gestured lamely toward the tray. "We already have food." Brock turned and strode to the desk before lifting the cover off of the food. "Chicken salad and a roll." He turned and grinned. "I don't think that's enough for the both of us." "We can order more." She dashed to the bedside table and picked up the phone. "I can call room service right now. It won't take long." This was ridiculous. She couldn't keep this up. A smile tugged up the corners of Brock's lips as he slowly shook his head. "No?" she asked. "No." He was walking toward her, tall, ripped, and devastatingly handsome. Ainsley set the phone back in his cradle, her eyes locked on his, her body frozen by his magnetism. He stopped in front of her and ran a finger down her jaw. She nearly melted. "I can't go out with you," she whispered, her heart stuttering with despair. To her surprise, he didn't look disappointed. Instead, his smile grew. "That's what you think." Confused, her brow furrowed. "It is?" His fingers lifted her chin, forcing her to keep her eyes on him. "You're wrong, Ainsley. You can do whatever you want." "I can?" He was wrong. He didn't know what she'd committed to. "Yes." Then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. She sighed as her eyes fluttered closed, and when he pulled away, she looked at him, her heart shattering anew. She loved him so much, but he would never be hers. Never. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't want him to see. She had to keep up the charade that she only cared about him as a friend, no matter how hard that would be. Stepping to the side, she looked down, then walked around him. Keeping her back to him, she swallowed the tears. "I'm sorry you came all this way, Brock, but you should go now." "I can't do that." Why, oh why, did he have to make this so hard? "Ainsley." His voice was so sexy,
so deep. She turned around to spite herself. Still, she kept her head down, her tears hidden. "Look at me." He stood 5 feet away, still too close for comfort. Wiping her eyes, she inhaled sharply, then slowly released a ragged breath, but she managed to get her emotions under control. Then she lifted her eyes to his. "I have something to tell you." There was nothing he could say that would mend her heart, nothing. He sat on the small couch tucked against one wall, then patted the seat next to him. Drawn to him despite her best efforts to resist, she trudged to the couch and sank onto the cushion beside him, turning to face him. He took her hands in his thumb tracing circles on her smooth skin. "Ainsley, you are, without a doubt, the most honorable woman I know." What? Where was this going? What did that have to do with anything? "Which is why Tommy knew he could take advantage of you." Ainsley's eyes went wide. What was he saying? How could he know? "Ainsley, you don't have to pretend any longer. I know all about Tommy and his deal." "How?" she sputtered. "How could you know? I didn't tell you. I kept my promise." His eyes softened, and he lifted one hand to stroke her face. "Yes, you kept your promise." "I never told." Realization dawned. "Wes told you, didn't he?" That must be why he hadn't called her back. He'd gone straight to his old friend Brock, told him everything. Slightly irritated with her brother for going behind her back, she was mostly thrilled that Brock had found out without her having to break her verbal contract. "Wait," she said, as the other half of the contract filled her mind. "I also promised that I would never be more than friends with you." Brock knowing the truth wouldn't change that. Rage at Tommy filled Brock, but for Ainsley's sake, he kept it at bay. Letting Ainsley know how he felt about Tommy wouldn't help her one iota. Instead, he had to convince her that the entire agreement was bogus. He would rather face the assault charges than have her feel like she needed to sacrifice for him. "You realize that was emotional blackmail, don't you?" Her forehead creased. "But I got what I wanted out of it. I agreed. He didn't make me agree. I did it of my own free will and choice." This was going to be harder than he thought. Nevertheless, he had one ace up his sleeve. "Think about it, Ainsley. How is it okay for him to demand that you change your feelings for someone? For no reason other than to drop those charges. Charges for doing something which I'm beginning to think he wanted to have happen." She stared at him, and he could see the wheels turning, then sadness filled her eyes. "Why does it matter?" Her voice was just above a whisper. "You're going back to your life in Sacramento, a life that doesn't include me." That's where she was wrong, and now it was time for him to tell her. So, Ainsley thought, Brock believed Tommy orchestrated the whole thing too. Well, the jerk had gotten what he wanted. Ainsley forced down the tears and the anger and focused on Brock, waited to hear what he would say. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "It matters," he said, his eyes sparkling and his voice soft, "because I'm in love with you, Ainsley." Her heart faltered, then went into a gallop. He loved her? Really? Was that possible? "You are?" His smile turned to a grin. "Yes, I am." Maybe there was hope. Maybe they could figure this out. Her eyes didn't move from his face. "I love you too." He gazed at her a moment longer, and then he drew her into his arms. She went willingly, happily. Held in his embrace, she felt safe, like he would protect her from all the evil in the world, from people like Tommy. "Ainsley," he murmured into her hair, "my sweet, sweet Ainsley." Smiling in contentment, she allowed herself to relax against him. She heard his phone buzz in his pocket. "I'm expecting some news," he said as he shifted to take the phone out of his pocket. Ainsley sat up, curious what was so important that he would let it interrupt this moment. He looked at the screen, then his face broke out in a wide smile. "He did it." "What?" Brock looked at her, and he seemed even happier than he had been before. He showed her the text. Ainsley read the words. "It's done." "I don't understand. What's done? Who's that from?" "My lawyer. While I was flying here, I asked him to draw up an agreement and to get Tommy to sign it." Ainsley's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I had my lawyer negotiate a monetary settlement with Tommy, a lot more than he would have gotten had he sued me, and in exchange, he agreed to never sue me for what happened." Brock's eyes sparkled. "And he agreed to release you from any contract, verbal or written." It took a moment for her to digest the news, to believe it. But when she did, she leapt to her feet, joy bursting within her. "No way!" Brock laughed, then he tugged her down beside him. "Way!" She threw her arms around him and burst into sobs. Sobs of relief and sobs of joy. "Hey," he said. "Hey, it's okay. Everything's okay now." She pulled back and smiled at him through the curtain of tears. "I can't believe you did that for me." He grinned. "You could say I did it for me. How else was I going to convince you to be part of my life?" She gazed at him, her heart bursting with emotion. "I love you so much." He cupped her face and used his thumbs to wipe away her tears. "I love you, Ainsley. Don't ever forget that." Then he pressed his lips to hers, and she knew she would never let anything keep them apart again. Chapter 22. "This is a nice place," Ainsley said, as Brock helped her into her seat at the restaurant, her heart overflowing with emotion. What he'd done for her, it had been beyond her wildest dreams, and she knew he truly loved her. "I'm glad you approve," he said, as he sat across from her. When he had insisted that they go out to eat, she'd readily agreed. Beyond grateful that her life was her own again, that she no longer had to hide the way she felt about him, she was ecstatic to be able to go out with him, to show the world that he was hers. They ordered their meal, then Brock leaned forward and took her hand in his. Loving the way it felt to be cared for by him, she smiled. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, his lips lifting into a smile. "What?" "I want you in my life, Ainsley. I hope I've made that clear." He had, and she couldn't be happier. "Yes." "As you know, I live in Sacramento, and I'm not in a position to move." She could see where this was going, and she had no problem moving. It would be good to get away from Tommy, to never see him again. "What I'm asking is, would you be willing to move to Sacramento?" "Yes." She spoke the word without hesitation. "I'm sure Sacramento could use another dental hygienist." He laughed. "Yes, I'm sure it could." Thrilled beyond measure that she had agreed so readily to move to Sacramento, to be with him, he had one more question for her. "Ainsley?" She looked at him, her blue eyes so full of trust that it almost hurt. What if things didn't work out between them? What if he failed her? He couldn't let that happen. He would do everything within his power to make her happy. Swallowing over his nervousness, he smiled. "When you move to Sacramento, you won't have a place to live. Would you want to move in with me?" He wasn't sure he was ready for that step, but she was making such a big change, he wanted to do everything he could to help her transition. The offer was sweet, it really was, but Ainsley shook her head. "I love you, I do, but I'm not ready to take that step." He smiled, and Ainsley read relief in his expression. Glad they were on the same page, she squeezed his hand. "But I hope we can see each other all the time." "We're going to spend so much time together that I hope you don't get sick of me." She laughed. That would never happen. "Unlikely, Brock." Chuckling, he said, "You say that now." Excitement surged through her. Her whole life was in front of her, and she was confident Brock would be part of her future now. The man she loved, the man who had already shown her what he was willing to do for her. Happiness cascaded over her, and as she looked into his eyes, she knew he was the same person she crushed on growing up, only better. Now he was hers. Hers to love, hers to care for, hers forever. This has been False Start, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2017 by Christine Kersey. Thanks for listening.